The Last Ice Age, The Lost World That Made Us. Chapter 1. Footprints on the Shore of a Vanished Lake. I want you to begin by picturing a single set of footprints. Not a city, not a monument, not a mountain of ice, though there is plenty of ice in this story, and we will get to it. I want you to picture bare human feet pressed into soft grey mud at the edge of a shallow lake, on a cool morning at the bottom of the world's last great cold age. The feet are small. They belong to a young person, a teenager maybe, or a slight young woman, we honestly can't be sure. And she is not walking alone. Every so often the trackway changes. The prints get deeper, and beside them appear the tiny, perfect prints of a toddler. Then the small prints vanish, and the larger ones get deeper still, and the stride shifts because she has bent down, scooped the child up onto her hip, and walked on carrying the extra weight. A little further, she sets the child down again. The little feet reappear, pattering alongside, then up again, down again. She crosses more than a mile of that lake bed like this. And then, and this is the part that I find almost unbearably moving, she makes the return journey alone. The child is not with her. She has left the little one somewhere, safe we hope, and she is walking back the way she came, on her own, her prints now steady and unburdened. And as she walks, the world walks with her. A giant ground sloth, a shaggy beast the size of a small car, with claws like sickles, lumbers across the same mud, and its tracks show it rising up, turning, pivoting, as though it has caught the scent of her and is wary. A mammoth crosses her outbound trail without breaking stride, a creature so enormous and so unbothered that it simply does not care that a human being passed this way. Now here is the thing that I need you to hold on to, because it is the doorway into this entire episode. Those footprints are real. You can go and see them. They were found on the floor of a dried-up lake called Lake Otero in the gypsum dunes of White Sands in New Mexico. And the best evidence we currently have says they were pressed into that mud somewhere around 21 to 23,000 years ago. Let that number settle. 22,000 years. That is not the age of the pyramids. The pyramids are barely 4,500 years old. These footprints are nearly 5 times older than that. They were made at the very coldest, harshest pit of the last ice age, when ice sheets 2 and 3 miles thick lay across the top of the world, when the sea was 120 meters lower than it is right now, when this young mother, if she was a mother, lived in a North America that no living human has ever seen, a continent that belonged to mammoths and saber-toothed cats and lions and dire wolves. And she stopped to carry her child. I want to be completely honest with you right at the start, because honesty is going to be one of the great pleasures of this journey. The date of those footprints is fiercely, ferociously argued about. There are serious scientists who think they might be thousands of years younger. We are going to come back to that fight later. It is one of the best detective stories in all of archaeology, and I promise you a front row seat. But whether it is 22,000 years or 15,000, the human truth of that trackway does not change. A young person in a frozen and dangerous world picked up a tired toddler and carried them across the mud. You know that gesture. You have done it, or had it done for you. It is the oldest tenderness we have a physical record of. That is what this episode is really about. Not just ice. The Ice Age is the lost world that made us, the cold, strange, crowded, dangerous earth in which our species was forged, in which we learned to sew clothes and build shelters and paint the walls of caves and bury our dead with 10,000 beads, in which we met and loved and lost other kinds of human being, and in which we very nearly did not survive at all. And I promise you this, by the time we reach the end, you will understand that the Ice Age did not end. It is still inside you, in your body, in your fears, in the cravings you can't explain, and in a few % of your own DNA. We are Ice Age animals, wearing modern clothes. This is the story of the world that shaped us, and how, against staggering odds, we have learned to read it. So let me take you there. Let me take you into the cold. Chapter 2. We are living inside an ice age right now. Let me start by correcting something, because almost everything you think you know about the ice age is a little bit wrong, and the truth is stranger and better. Here is the first surprise. We are living inside an ice age right now. At this very moment, as you listen to this, there is permanent ice at both of the Earth's poles, a vast sheet sitting on Antarctica, another on Greenland. For most of our planet's long history, that was not true. For most of the last few 100 million years, Earth was a hothouse with no permanent polar ice at all, where the poles were forests and swamps. A planet with ice caps on both ends is actually the exception, not the rule. And by the formal definition geologists use, as long as there is permanent ice sitting at the poles, you are technically in an ice age. So when people say the last ice age, they don't really mean a separate frozen episode that came and went. What they mean is the most recent cold peak inside the long ice age we are still in. Because here is the second surprise. This long cold age, it has been running for about 2.5 million years, does not stay at one temperature. It pulses. It breathes. It swings slowly and rhythmically between long, brutal cold spells, which we call glacial periods, and shorter warm spells, which we call interglacials. You and I are living in an interglacial, a warm gap. It is called the Holocene, and it has lasted for about 11,700 years, and every single thing you think of as human history, farming, cities, writing, the wheel, the internet, all of it happened inside this one warm pause. The entire human adventure of civilization is something we did in the brief gap between the ice. And the cold spell that came before our warm gap, the most recent glacial period, that is what people mean by the last ice age. It began creeping in around 115,000 years ago, and it gripped the planet, with some wobbles and reversals we will talk about, until about 11,700 years ago. The very deepest, coldest, most extreme part of it, the bottom of the pit, has a name, and you are going to hear that name many, many times tonight, so let's make friends with it now. It is called the last glacial maximum, the maximum extent of the ice. It peaked around 22 to 20,000 years ago, which means our young mother at White Sands was walking right through the worst of it. Now, how cold are we actually talking? And here I want to be careful and honest, because this is a number that scientists have been busily arguing about and refining in just the last few years. The old textbook figure was that the whole planet, on average, was about 6 degrees Celsius colder than it was just before the industrial age. More recent work has nudged that down a little. Some careful studies put the global average cooling closer to 4.5 degrees, others keep it nearer 6. The honest, current answer is somewhere in the range of 4.5 to 6 degrees Celsius colder, on average, across the whole globe. And I can feel some of you thinking, that's it, 4 to 6 degrees, that's a chilly afternoon. But here is why that number is so deceptive and so important. That is the global average, and the average hides the violence. The tropics only cooled by a couple of degrees, but the further you went from the equator, the worse it got. The middle latitudes, Europe, the interior of North America, cooled by 10 or 12 degrees. And over the great ice sheets themselves, in the depths of a bad, cold snap, the temperature could drop 40 or 50 degrees below what we'd find there now. This is the single most important thing to understand about climate, and it will come roaring back at the end of this episode when we talk about our own century. A change of just a few degrees in the global average is not a minor thing. It is the difference between the world outside your window and a world where ice sheets bury New York and Berlin. A few degrees moved enough water onto the land as ice to drop the oceans by 120 meters. A few degrees is the difference between an interglacial and an apocalypse of ice. Hold that thought. We will need it. And the air itself was different. We know this, and this genuinely gives me chills, because we have actual samples of the ancient atmosphere, which I'll explain in a moment. The air our young mother breathed at White Sands had far less carbon dioxide in it than the air you are breathing now. She breathed an atmosphere with around 180 to 190 parts per million of carbon dioxide, the lowest level in at least the last 800,000 years. Just before the Industrial Revolution, that figure was about 280. Today, it is over 420 and climbing. So the swing from her frozen world to the warm one we evolved to enjoy was a rise of about 90 parts per million. We have added more than that again in well under 2 centuries. But I am getting ahead of myself. Hold that thought too. So that is the stage. Not a single frozen planet, but a world breathing slowly between cold and warm, and us alive at the bottom of the last great cold breath. The obvious question is, how on earth do we know any of this? How do we know what the temperature was, or what the air was made of 22,000 years ago? And the answer to that is one of the most beautiful detective stories in all of science. So let me tell you how we cracked it. Chapter 3: The Boulders That Should Not Be There, and the Air Trapped in Ice. For most of human history, nobody knew there had ever been an ice age. The idea would have sounded insane. And the story of how we figured it out begins, as the best science stories so often do, with someone noticing something that simply did not make sense. Picture the lowlands of Switzerland, or northern Germany, or England a couple of 100 years ago, and scattered across those gentle green fields and valleys are boulders, enormous boulders, some of them the size of houses. And here is the puzzle: they are the wrong kind of rock. A massive lump of granite would be sitting in the middle of a limestone valley, hundreds of miles from the nearest place that granite naturally occurs. They are called erratics, from the Latin for wandering, because the rock has, impossibly, wandered far from home. How do you move a rock the size of a house across 100 miles of countryside? For centuries, the answer was Noah's flood. A great deluge, people said, had washed these stones across the land. It was the only force anyone could imagine that was big enough. And then a Swiss naturalist named Louis Agassiz looked at the glaciers in the high Alps, and he saw something everyone else had missed. He saw that the glaciers were moving. Slowly, over years, these rivers of ice crept downhill, and as they crept, they carried things. They picked up boulders and rubble and dragged them along, and they scratched deep parallel grooves into the bedrock beneath them, and where they finally melted, they dumped their cargo of rock in long ridges. Agassiz walked the Swiss lowlands, far from any glacier, and he found those same scratches. He found those same ridges of dumped rubble. He found the erratic boulders sitting exactly where a melting glacier would have left them. And in 1837, he stood up in front of a scientific society and made an audacious, almost unhinged claim that the whole of northern Europe had once been buried under ice, that there had been, in his words, a great ice time, a vanished age of cold. People thought he was mad. The idea that sheets of ice had once covered Europe, that London and Berlin had been under a glacier, was met with ridicule. But the evidence was everywhere, once you knew how to read it, and over the following decades, as more and more geologists found the same fingerprints across 2 continents, the truth became undeniable. Agassiz had been right. There had been an ice age. He even gave us the word. Now that told us the ice had been here, but it couldn't tell us when, or how cold, or what the air was like. For that we needed something almost magical, and we didn't find it until the 1960s. And when I tell you what it is, I want you to really feel how wonderful it is. We drill into ice. Think about how a glacier or an ice sheet forms. Every year, snow falls. The next year, more snow falls on top of it, pressing the old snow down, squeezing it into ice. And in that ice, sealed forever, are tiny bubbles of air, actual air, the literal atmosphere from the year that snow fell. Each year lays down a new layer. So an ice sheet is a stack of years, going down and down into the past, and trapped inside it is a perfectly preserved record. The temperature, written into the chemistry of the water itself, and the actual ancient atmosphere held in those little bubbles. When scientists drill out a long cylinder of that ice, an ice core, and bring it up, they are holding a column of time. Near the top, the layers are from last year. Go deeper and you pass through the Roman Empire, the building of the pyramids, the first farmers. Deeper still, and you cross into the Ice Age. And when they crack open the bubbles from the deepest layers, the gas that hisses out is air that no human ever breathed, air from the frozen world. That is how we know the carbon dioxide was 190 parts per million. We didn't estimate it, we measured it. We opened a bottle of Ice Age sky. And it gets better. In the depths of Antarctica, at a place called Dome Sea, an international team drilled a core that goes down more than 3 kilometers and reaches back 800,000 years. 800,000 years of climate, year by year, breath by breath. And when you read that record, the pattern leaps out at you with a clarity that is genuinely breathtaking. The slow, rhythmic swing between cold and warm. Long descents into glaciation, then sudden snaps back into warmth, over and over and over, 8 times across that record, as regular as a great slow heartbeat. In Greenland, where it snows much more heavily, the layers are thicker, and you can count individual years like tree rings. The Greenland cores let us see the Ice Age not in blurry millennia, but in sharp decades, and they revealed something that nobody expected and that should frighten us, which we'll come to, that the climate of the Ice Age was not a steady, deep freeze. It was wild. It lurched. It flipped between cold and warmer states sometimes within a single human lifetime. So when I give you a temperature or a carbon dioxide level or tell you the climate flipped in a decade, I am not guessing. I am reading the ice. The frozen world kept a diary. And the deepest theme of this entire episode, I'm going to name it now, so you can watch for it, is that the cold, which destroyed so much, also preserved. Ice and frozen ground are nature's great archivists. They kept the air. They kept the bodies of mammoths with the flowers still in their mouths. They kept fragile insects and ancient DNA and footprints in the mud. The same cold that made the world so hard to live in is the reason we can read it at all. Destruction and preservation locked together. You are going to hear that paradox again and again. But the ice didn't just record the climate. It raises a much deeper question. Why? What turns the planet's thermostat down for 100,000 years and then back up? What actually causes an ice age? And the answer to that lies, of all places, in the shape of the Earth's path around the sun, and in the mind of a Serbian engineer doing sums in a prisoner of war camp. Chapter 4: The Clock in the Sky. So what causes an ice age? For a long time this was a genuine mystery, and the answer, when it came, is one of my favorite ideas in all of science, because it connects the ice on the ground to the movements of the heavens. The cold did not come from the sun getting weaker or from some catastrophe. It came from tiny, regular wobbles in the way the Earth travels around the sun. There is a clock in the sky, and it has been ticking for billions of years, and it is the clock that paces the ice. Here is how it works. We tend to imagine the Earth's orbit as a fixed, tidy circle and the planet spinning neatly on its axis. But none of that is quite stable. There are 3 slow rhythms, and a man named Milutin Milankovitch is the one who worked out that they govern the ice, so they carry his name. the Milankovitch cycles. The first rhythm is the shape of our orbit. Over a cycle of about 100,000 years, the Earth's path around the Sun slowly stretches from very nearly circular to slightly more of an oval, and back again. The second rhythm is the tilt of our axis. The Earth leans over as it spins. That lean is what gives us our seasons. But the angle of the lean nods up and down, between about 22 and 24.5 degrees, over a cycle of around 41,000 years. More tilt means more extreme seasons. Less tilt means milder ones. And the third rhythm is a slow wobble. Like a spinning top that's losing its balance, the Earth's axis traces a great slow circle over about 23,000 years, which changes the time of year when we are closest to the Sun. Now, here is the crucial, subtle, beautiful point that took genius to see. None of these wobbles changes the total amount of sunlight the Earth gets by very much at all. The change in the global average is tiny. What they change is the timing and the placement, specifically, how much sun falls on the far northern latitudes in summer. And Milankovitch realized that this, the strength of the northern summer, is the thing that matters. Because ice ages aren't really about how cold the winter gets. They are about whether the previous winter's snow survives the summer. If the northern summers are cool and weak, the winter snows don't fully melt. A little stays through the summer. Next winter, more falls on top. The snow lingers year after year, building, thickening, refusing to melt, and slowly, over thousands of years, it grows into an ice sheet. Cool northern summers are how you build a glacier. That was his insight. Ice ages are made not in winter, but in the failure of summer. Milankovitch worked all this out, doing the calculations by hand, a staggering labor of arithmetic, in the early 20th century. And there is a detail in his story I cannot resist telling you because it is so human. He did a great deal of his work as a prisoner. He was a Serbian, captured during the First World War, and he carried on his calculations in captivity, filling notebooks with sums about the orbit of the Earth and the coming and going of the ice while the world tore itself apart around him. For decades, almost nobody believed him. He died in 1958, still largely ignored. And then, in the 1970s, scientists pulled long cores from the deep-sea floor, measured the rhythm of the ice ages locked in the mud, ran the numbers, and there they were. Milankovitch's cycles. The 100,000-year beat, the 41,000-year beat, the 23,000-year beat, written into the planet's climate exactly as a forgotten man had calculated. They named the cycles after him. I think that's glorious. The prisoner was right. And this is where I have to be honest with you, because the honesty is the thrill, the clock in the sky is not the whole story. In fact, there's a problem with it that has bothered scientists for decades, and it still isn't fully solved. The wobble that supposedly dominates the ice ages, the 100,000-year one, the change in the shape of the orbit, is by far the weakest of the three. The actual change in sunlight it produces is feeble, far too feeble, on its own, to bury continents in ice. And yet that is the rhythm that shows up most strongly in the record. A weak push producing a huge result. They literally call it the 100,000-year problem, and I want to be straight with you, it is not solved. There are several competing ideas, good minds on each side, and no clear winner. The most honest thing I can tell you is that the heartbeat of the ice ages is real, we can read it perfectly, and we still do not fully understand why it beats the way it does. I find that wonderful, not frustrating. The ice age still has secrets. What we do understand is how a feeble nudge becomes a frozen planet, and the answer is feedbacks. The way the climate system, once pushed, amplifies the push. There are two great amplifiers, and they will both matter enormously at the end of this story. The first is ice itself. Fresh snow and ice are brilliantly white, and white reflects sunlight straight back into space. Dark ocean and dark forest absorb it as heat. So when the orbital clock nudges the planet a little cooler and a little more ice forms, that new ice reflects away more sunlight, which cools the planet further, which makes more ice, which reflects more sunlight. It is a runaway loop, a snowball rolling downhill, and it roughly doubles the cooling from the original nudge. The same loop runs in reverse when the ice starts to melt, which is exactly why deglaciation, when it comes, can be so terrifyingly fast. The second amplifier is the air, that missing carbon dioxide. As the planet cooled, the oceans pulled huge quantities of carbon dioxide down out of the atmosphere and locked it away in the deep sea. And here's a genuinely new piece of the story, from work published just in the last couple of years. It now looks as though the bulk of that carbon drawdown, most of that 90 part per million plunge, was driven by biology and circulation in the Southern Ocean, around Antarctica, as expanding sea ice sealed off the surface of the sea from the sky and changed the way the deep ocean turned over. Less carbon dioxide in the air meant a weaker greenhouse effect, which meant more cooling, which the ice amplified further. The orbit set the rhythm. The ice and the ocean did the heavy lifting. So that is how you freeze a planet. A faint, regular nudge from the geometry of the heavens, caught and magnified by white ice and a carbon-starved sky, building over tens of thousands of years into something colossal. And colossal is the right word, because once that ice got going, it built mountains. Let me show you the world it made. Chapter 5. A World of Ice, a World Made New. I want you to stand with me now in North America, around 22,000 years ago, at the deepest cold. Look north and the horizon is wrong. It is too high, and it is white, and it does not move. You are looking at a wall of ice, the edge of a sheet of frozen water so vast it is almost impossible to make the mind hold it. It is called the Laurentide Ice Sheet, and it covered nearly all of Canada and the northern United States, reaching as far south as where New York City and the Ohio River are today. At its center, over Hudson Bay, it was 3 to 4 kilometers thick. Let me say that again so it lands. A dome of solid ice, 2.5 miles deep, sitting on top of a continent. If you had stood at the center of it, the ground beneath you would have been pressed down so hard by the sheer weight that the bedrock itself was sagging into the earth. And it was not the only one. Across the Atlantic, another great sheet smothered Scandinavia, Finland, and the Baltic, and reached across to merge with a sheet sitting on top of Britain and Ireland. Northern Europe gone, under 2 or 3 kilometers of ice. There was ice across the shelves north of Siberia. The Alps were buried under a merged ice cap that sent glacial tongues spilling out into the lowlands. In South America, an ice sheet draped the southern Andes. New Zealand, Tasmania, the high mountains of Africa, all of them carried far more ice than they do today. This was a planet wearing armor. And all of that water, the water locked up in those titanic sheets of ice, had to come from somewhere. It came from the sea. So much of the world's water was stacked up on the land as ice that the oceans drained down and down until they sat about 120 meters, nearly 400 feet, lower than they are today. I really want you to feel what that means, because this is one of the most haunting facts in the whole story, and it is the source of one of our great emotional threads. When you drop the sea by 120 meters, you don't just give the beaches a wider margin. You expose the gently sloping shelves around the edges of every continent. You unveil whole countries. About 25 million square kilometers of new land emerged from the sea, an area equal to something like a fifth of all the land on Earth today. Continents grew. Islands joined hands. The map of the world that you carry in your head, the familiar shapes of the coastlines, simply did not exist. It was a different planet, geometrically, and it was bigger. Where Britain is now an island, it was a peninsula, joined to mainland Europe by a vast, low, rolling plain that ran across what is now the bottom of the North Sea. We have a name for that lost country now, Doggerland, and we'll walk across it together soon. Where the Bering Strait now separates Russia from Alaska by icy water, there was instead a broad grassy land bridge, 1,000 kilometers wide from north to south, joining the two continents into one, a lost land we call Beringia, and it is the door through which the Americas were peopled. Southeast Asia was not a scatter of islands, but a single great continent, which we call Sunderland, where you could walk from Vietnam to Borneo. Australia and New Guinea were fused into one enormous landmass. These were not minor adjustments. Whole worlds of dry land, the size of nations, that are now drowned beneath the waves, and people lived on them. Their homes are down there still, under the sea. The cold also rearranged everything that grew. The neat bands of climate we know today were all shoved toward the equator and squeezed. Where there is now thick forest across Europe and North America, there was instead a vast, cold, treeless grassland, a frozen prairie that we'll devote a whole chapter to, because it was the richest ecosystem this kind of planet has ever seen. The great forests of the temperate world retreated into tiny pockets of shelter, called refugia, down in the warm corners of Spain, Italy, and the Balkans, where the trees waited out the cold age. The Sahara was bigger and drier. The Amazon shrank and broke into patches. Beneath the southern edges of the ice sheets, the meltwater pooled into freshwater lakes bigger than anything we have today. One of them, Lake Agassiz, in the middle of North America, would eventually grow larger than all of the present Great Lakes put together, and it is going to play a dramatic, almost villainous role later in our story. And dust. The Ice Age world was dusty. The expanded deserts and the bare, unvegetated ground threw up far more dust than today's world, so much that you can see it as thick layers in the ice cores, 2 to 5 times the levels of the warm period. The sky was often hazy with wind-blown silt. It was a colder, drier, dustier, browner, bigger, emptier planet, with 2 of its corners crushed under miles of ice, and its middle stretched out into new land. That is the stage. That is the transformed Earth. And it would be easy to imagine that such a world was dead, a frozen wasteland. But it was the opposite. That cold, dry, grassy world was teeming with more giant animals than any landscape on Earth has held in millions of years. And teeming, too, with people, and not only with people like us. Let me take you out onto that great frozen grassland and show you who lived there. Chapter 6. The Drowned Countries. Before we meet the animals and the people, I want to take you walking through the lost lands, because they are the part of this story that I think about most, and because they carry one of our deepest emotional threads, the worlds that the Ice Age made and the sea took back. Come with me first to Doggerland. If you got into a boat today and sailed out into the middle of the North Sea, between England and Denmark, you would be floating over a country. Not the ruins of one, a whole landscape, a real place where people lived for thousands of years, now lying 20, 50, 90 meters beneath the cold grey water. During the Ice Age and the long thaw that followed, that entire basin was dry land. A great low plain of rolling hills, marshes, and woodland. A huge river system flowed across it, the combined waters of the Rhine and the Thames and the Elbe, braided together into one mighty channel running northwest toward the distant shelf edge. Reindeer and wild horses and mammoths moved across it, and human beings lived there. They hunted, they fished, they raised their children, they buried their dead, on land that is now the floor of the sea. We know they were there because of a strange and wonderful thing. Fishing boats dragging their nets across a shallow sandbank called the Dogger Bank, the bank that gives the lost country its name, keep pulling up the past. Not fish, mammoth bones, the teeth of woolly rhinos, and every so often beautifully made tools of flint and antler harpoon points, worked bone, fished up out of the dark by trawlermen who had no idea at first what they were hauling onto their decks. An entire vanished world, surfacing a few objects at a time in fishing nets. And here is the part that haunts me. As the ice age ended and the great sheets melted, the sea came back. It rose and rose, and it took Doggerland not all at once in most places, but steadily, decade by decade, century by century, swallowing the low ground, turning hills into islands, turning islands into shoals, turning a country into a sea. The people who lived there would have watched, across generations, as the water came for their homeland. Families would have had to retreat, again and again, to higher ground that kept becoming lower ground. There may have been a final, brutal blow. Some evidence suggests a gigantic underwater landslide off the coast of Norway sent a tsunami sweeping across the last remnants of Doggerland. Britain became an island for good around 8,000 years ago. A whole human geography, gone, drowned, remembered now only by the bones in the fishermen's nets. Now come to the other side of the world, to the land bridge that changed everything. Where Russia and Alaska now stare at each other across the icy Bering Strait, the low sea of the Ice Age exposed a broad, grassy land that joined the two continents into one. Beringia. It was not a narrow causeway, it was a vast plain, 1,000 kilometers wide from north to south. A cold, dry, windswept steppe that, crucially, stayed mostly free of ice. And it was alive, grass and sedge feeding herds of mammoth, bison, horse, and caribou, with humans following the herds. Beringia is the door. It is the doorway through which the entire human population of the Americas, every indigenous nation from the Arctic to Patagonia, first walked, or rather first lived. Because the genetics now tell us something remarkable, which we'll explore in full later. The ancestors of Native Americans seem to have lingered in this land bridge world, possibly for thousands of years, cut off, in a kind of long pause we call the Beringian standstill, before they finally spread south into two empty continents. And then, like Doggerland, when the ice melted and the seas rose, Beringia drowned. The door closed behind them. The bridge they had crossed sank beneath the waves, and the old world and the new were severed for thousands of years until ships found each other again. And there are more drowned countries. Across Southeast Asia, the low sea exposed an enormous continent we call Sunderland, a single landmass where Malaysia, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo are now separate islands. You could have walked from the Asian mainland out across what is now open tropical sea. It was forest, not grassland, home to elephants, rhinos, tigers, and orangutans. Further on, Australia and New Guinea were welded together into one giant continent we call Sahel. And in between Sunda and Sahel lay a scatter of deep-water channels that never closed, even at the lowest tide of the Ice Age, a gap of open ocean that you could not walk across. You had to cross it by sea. Remember that gap. It is the setting for what may be the single most astonishing thing human beings did during the entire Ice Age, and we'll come to it. I find these drowned lands almost unbearably poignant. Doggerland, Beringia, Sunderland, these were not marginal places. They were homelands, hunting grounds, the whole world to the people who lived on them. And they are gone beneath the sea because the planet warmed and the ice melted and the water rose. People watched their countries drown. That happened. It is one of the deepest human experiences of the end of the Ice Age, and it is a memory worth carrying as we move into our own century of rising seas. But for now, hold the image, a country under the water, and let me take you up onto the greatest of the lands that did not drown, the cold, golden grassland that was the beating heart of the Ice Age world. Chapter 7. The Mammoth Steppe, the greatest grassland Earth has ever known. I want to take you out onto a grassland, and I want to warn you in advance that it is going to surprise you, because everything about it seems like it should be impossible. Stretch your imagination across the whole top of the world 22,000 years ago. From the plains of Spain, eastward across all of Europe, across the whole of Russia and Siberia, over the Beringian land bridge, and into Alaska and the Yukon, an unbroken belt of grassland, the largest single ecosystem the Earth has ever known. More than 40 million square kilometers of it, about 3 times the size of modern Russia. One continuous golden plain, wrapping most of the way around the northern hemisphere. We call it the Mammoth Steppe, and here is the thing that makes it so strange and so wonderful. By every rule we think we know, it should not have been able to exist. The climate was savage, bitterly cold, and bone dry, with as little rain as a modern desert, only 150 to 300 millimeters a year. The ground was frozen solid for most of its depth, permafrost reaching down 100 meters or more, with only the top meter or two thawing in the brief summer. And yet, and this is the paradox that scientists puzzle over to this day, this freezing, near-desert grassland was astonishingly, almost impossibly productive. When you dig into the frozen soils of Siberia and count the bones, you find that this cold steppe supported a density of large grazing animals comparable to the modern African savanna. The Serengeti, on a frozen desert. That is the productivity paradox of the Mammoth Steppe, and it is genuinely one of the great puzzles of Ice Age ecology. How a few things came together. The summers, though short, were intensely bright. At those high latitudes, the sun barely set, pouring near 24-hour daylight onto the grass during the growing season. The permafrost stopped water from draining away and stopped deep tree roots from taking hold, which favored fast, nutritious grasses over slow forests. And there is a third factor, and it is the one I find most thought-provoking because it turns the usual story on its head. There is a hypothesis, associated above all with a remarkable Russian scientist named Sergei Zimov, that the animals didn't just live on the grassland. The animals made the grassland. The idea is that the immense herds of mammoth, horse, bison, and reindeer were ecosystem engineers. By grazing down the moss and shrubs, by trampling and churning the soil, by fertilizing it with their dung, by knocking down any tree that tried to establish itself, the great herds actively maintained the open, productive grass, kept it from sliding into the mossy, soggy, low-grade tundra we see across much of the far north today. On this view, the steppe and the giants were a single self-sustaining system, each one keeping the other alive. And if that is true, it has a chilling implication, which we'll return to right at the end of this story when we talk about the death of the giants. It means that when the great herds vanished, the grassland may have collapsed with them, not the other way around. The animals didn't just disappear because their habitat changed. The habitat may have changed because the animals disappeared. Zimov has spent decades trying to test this in real life. On a patch of Siberia he calls Pleistocene Park, reintroducing horses and bison and musk ox to see whether the grassland comes back. It is a beautiful, strange, and deeply serious experiment, and it ties this ancient world directly to our warming present, because that frozen ground holds more carbon than the entire atmosphere. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me just put you there for a moment on the steppe in summer, the sun low and golden and refusing to set. Grasses and wormwood and small flowering herbs stretching to every horizon, broken by low willow thickets along the watercourses, the air smelling of crushed grass and animal dung, and the ground trembling faintly because somewhere not far off, a herd of 6-ton animals is moving. This was not a frozen wasteland. It was a frozen Serengeti, vast and golden and alive, and it was the single greatest theater of large animals in the history of the planet. So let me raise the curtain on the cast. Let me introduce you to the giants. Chapter 8: A Walk Among the Giants. I have been promising you giants, and now I get to deliver them, and I have to confess that this is one of my favorite chapters to tell, because the animals of the Ice Age are so magnificent and so strange that they sound invented. They were not. They were real, and people lived among them. Let me introduce you to a few of my favorites. We begin, of course, with the woolly mammoth, because it is the emblem of the whole age, and it deserves to be. Picture an animal stockier and denser than an African elephant, standing up to 3.5 meters at the shoulder, weighing 6 tons, wrapped in a shaggy double coat of yellow-brown and reddish hair, with a thick cape of fat beneath the skin, small ears and a short tail to limit frostbite, and a great curving pair of tusks, up to 4 meters long, that it swept side to clear snow off the frozen grass. This was not a cold elephant. It was a creature engineered down to its genes for the ice. We can read the very mutations in its recovered DNA that thickened its fat, tuned its body clock to the strange polar light, and let its blood carry oxygen in the thin, cold air. And because the cold preserves, we don't just have mammoth bones, we have mammoths, frozen whole in the Siberian permafrost, with skin and hair and flesh and stomach contents intact after tens of thousands of years. There is one famous specimen, recovered well over a century ago, that died around 44,000 years ago, and when they opened its mouth, it still held the buttercups it had been eating. Buttercups. Summer flowers, crushed between the teeth of an animal that has been dead since before the last glacial maximum. There is the whole paradox of the Ice Age in a single image. A flower, a moment of an ordinary summer afternoon, held perfectly in ice across 44,000 years. I think about that a lot. But the mammoth was only the headline act. Grazing beside it on the steppe was the woolly rhinoceros, 2 tons of armored, double-coated grazer with 2 enormous horns, the front one flattened and worn from sweeping the snow. There was the giant deer, often called the Irish elk, which had the most absurd and magnificent antlers of any animal that has ever lived. A span of up to 3.5 meters, tip to tip, weighing 40 kilograms, that the males grew and shed every single year, an extravagance of bone so enormous it staggers belief. And there were monsters hunting all of them. The cave lion, a true lion, larger than the African lions of today, that ranged from Spain to Siberia and which Ice Age people painted on cave walls. The cave bear, bigger than a grizzly. The cave hyena, hunting in packs across Europe. In North America, the sabre-toothed cat, Smilodon, not especially fast, but built like a wrestler, with forelimbs of terrifying power to pin its prey, and those famous canines, up to 28 centimeters long, serrated like steak knives, that it sank into the throat of an animal it had already wrestled to the ground. We know Smilodon so intimately because of one of the great accidental graveyards of all time, the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, where animals got mired in sticky asphalt, and their struggles drew in predators who got mired in turn, and the whole grisly drama was preserved. Over 2,000 saber-tooth skulls pulled from one set of pits. And North America had stranger things still. The short-faced bear, which stood enormously tall, had long, slender legs, and may have been able to run at 40 miles an hour, the fastest bear that ever lived. The Colombian mammoth, even bigger than the woolly. And in South America, a true bestiary of the impossible. Giant ground sloths the size of elephants, 4 tons of muscle and claw, rearing up on their hind legs and a thick tail to strip the trees. That's the beast whose tracks crossed the woman's trail at White Sands. The glyptodon, an armored mammal the size and shape of a small car, encased in a dome of fused bony plates with a heavy club of a tail. And in Australia, an entire separate caste of marsupial giants. Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived, a wombat relative the size of a hippopotamus, nearly 3 tons. Giant kangaroos 2 meters tall, a marsupial lion with a bite for its size, stronger than any mammal carnivore alive, and a monitor lizard megalania, perhaps 5 meters long, a Komodo dragon scaled up to nightmare proportions. This was the world, not a frozen emptiness, a planet absolutely crowded with megafauna on every continent, the richest community of giant animals since the dinosaurs. And here is the sentence I most want you to carry out of this chapter, because the whole back half of our story turns on it. Almost all of these animals are now gone. The mammoth, the woolly rhino, the giant deer, the cave lion, the saber-tooth, the ground sloth, the glyptodon, diprotodon, extinct. The earth you and I live on is an impoverished, emptied-out shadow of the world I have just described. We live in the after. We arrived in time to see the giants, and then they vanished, and the question of why, whether it was the climate or whether it was us, is one of the most painful and contested questions in all of science, and I promise we will face it honestly before the end. But to ask whether it was us, you first have to meet us. And us, in the Ice Age, is not a simple word, because our species was not walking that world alone. Chapter 9. We were not alone. Here is a fact that I think is one of the most profound and most underappreciated truths about our deep past, and I want to give it the weight it deserves. For almost the entire span of the Ice Age, there was more than one kind of human being alive on Earth at the same time. I know that sounds strange, because today there is only us. One single human species spread over the entire planet with no close relatives. Our nearest living cousins are chimpanzees, and they are very far away from us indeed. We are so used to being alone that we assume it is the natural state of things. It is not. It is a very recent and, frankly, a very lonely development. For most of the time human beings have existed, the world held several kinds of us at once, sharing the same landscapes, sometimes meeting, sometimes, as we will see, falling in love. At the deepest cold of the last ice age, there were at least 4 kinds of human walking the earth. Let me introduce them. First, there is us Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans who had emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago and begun spreading out across the world. And I want to puncture a piece of vanity right now because it matters. During the Ice Age, we were not the lords of creation. We were rare and we were fragile, and we very nearly didn't make it. The best estimates suggest that at the depth of the cold, the entire global population of our species may have numbered somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 individuals. Fewer people than live in a single modern city, scattered in tiny bands across the whole of the old world. Some geneticists argue the bottleneck was even tighter. We were, in those days, an endangered species. Everything you are, everything humanity has ever built, descends from that handful of cold, hungry, frightened bands hanging on through the ice. Second, there are the Neanderthals, and they are so important and so misunderstood that I'm going to give them a whole chapter of their own later. For now, let me just demolish the cartoon. The Neanderthals were not shambling, grunting brutes. They were a sophisticated kind of human who had lived in Europe and Western Asia for over 200,000 years, far longer than our species has yet managed. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. They made fine tools, used fire expertly, hunted the most dangerous game on the steppe, cared for their sick and injured, and very probably buried their dead and made symbols. They were cold-adapted, powerfully built, brilliant survivors, and we overlapped with them in Europe for thousands of years. Third, and this one is genuinely thrilling because of how we found them, there are the Denisovans. And the Denisovans are a ghost species. For almost all of history, nobody knew they had ever existed. There was no skeleton, no skull, no fossil that anyone had recognized. They were discovered in 2010 from a single fragment of a finger bone found in a cave called Denisova in the mountains of Siberia. A scrap of bone the size of a pebble. Scientists extracted DNA from it, sequenced it, and realized with astonishment that it belonged to a kind of human that science had never seen, neither us nor Neanderthal, but a third lineage, entirely unknown. An entire population of human beings who had lived across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, revealed by molecular biology before we had so much as a face to put to them. For years, the Denisovans were known almost entirely through their genes, a people made of pure information. Only very recently have we begun to match them to actual fossils, including, just last year, the realization that a strange, massive skull from China nicknamed Dragon Man is in fact a Denisovan, giving this ghost species a face at last. And fourth, out on the islands of Southeast Asia, there were stranger cousins still. On the Indonesian island of Flores lived Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit, a tiny species of human, barely over a meter tall, that had shrunk over hundreds of thousands of years of isolation on its island, the way large animals often do when trapped on islands. They hung on Flores until perhaps 50,000 years ago. And on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, there was yet another small-bodied island human, Homo luzonensis. The Ice Age world was not a solo performance. It was a chorus of humanity, several kinds of us at once, scattered from the steppes of Siberia to the tropical islands of the Pacific. So picture that. A young Homo sapiens band, moving north into Europe 45,000 years ago, would have walked into a continent that already belonged to someone else, a continent that had been Neanderthal homeland for 250,000 years. They would have met them. They would have seen the smoke of Neanderthal fires. And what happened when those meetings occurred is written, to this day, inside your own body, because we did not simply replace our cousins. The astonishing truth, which the genetic revolution of the last 15 years has uncovered, is that we met them, and we mingled with them, and we carry them still. Let me tell you about the ghost in your genome. Chapter 10. The Ghost in Your Genome. I want to tell you about one of the greatest scientific revolutions of our lifetime, a revolution so recent that most of it has happened in the last 15 years, and it is the reading of ancient DNA. It has done for the deep human past what the deciphering of lost scripts did for ancient history. It has let the dead speak, and the man at the center of it deserves to be as famous as Darwin. His name is Svante Pääbo, and for decades he chased what nearly everyone told him was impossible, recovering the actual genetic code of human beings who had been dead for tens of thousands of years. DNA is fragile. After death, it shatters into tiny pieces and degrades, and any ancient sample is hopelessly contaminated with the DNA of every modern person who has handled the bones, and with bacteria. To read a Neanderthal genome, you had to solve all of that, build clean rooms, develop ways to stitch together fragments 30 letters long, learn to recognize the chemical signature of genuinely ancient DNA. Pääbo and his team did it. In 2010, they published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome, sequenced from bones from a cave in Croatia. In 2022, Svante Pääbo was awarded the Nobel Prize, and what his work revealed rewrote the human story. Here is the headline, and I want you to feel how strange and intimate it is. If your ancestry lies anywhere outside of Africa, if you are European or Asian or Native American or from Oceania, then you are right now carrying Neanderthal DNA in your cells. Somewhere between 1 and 2% of your entire genome was inherited, not from Homo sapiens, but from Neanderthals. The cousins we thought we had simply replaced are not entirely gone. They are inside us. When our ancestors walked into Ice Age Europe and met the people who had lived there for 250,000 years, they did not only compete with them, they had children with them. And those children had children, on, down all the generations to you. And it gets richer. Remember the Denisovans, the ghost species from the finger bone. They are in us too. People from Melanesia, from Aboriginal Australia, from parts of Southeast Asia carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA, even more than the Neanderthal share. Some of us carry traces of both. Our ancestors, spreading out across the Ice Age world, interbred with at least two other kinds of human, repeatedly, across tens of thousands of years. And here is my favorite single object in this whole part of the story, because it makes the abstraction suddenly, achingly real. In that same Denisovan cave in Siberia, scientists found a sliver of bone from a young girl, about 13 years old, who died around 90,000 years ago. They sequenced her DNA, and what they found stopped them cold. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan. She was a first-generation hybrid, the direct child of two different kinds of human being. We have nicknamed her Denny. Think about what that means. It means these were not rare, freak encounters. It means that on the Ice Age frontier, where the ranges of different human species overlapped, they were meeting and pairing and raising children together, closely enough and often enough that we managed to stumble on the direct daughter of two species from a single scrap of bone. The first person whose parents we have identified, and they belonged to two different kinds of human. Now I want to be honest about the harder edges of this, because the truth is more interesting than a simple love story. When scientists look closely at the Neanderthal DNA inside us, they find something telling. There are great stretches of our genome, they call them deserts, where Neanderthal DNA is completely absent. It has been scrubbed out. And the most likely reason is that some Neanderthal gene combinations simply didn't work well in a Homo sapiens body, that the hybrid children, in certain respects, were less fertile or less healthy, and natural selection quietly weeded those genes out, generation after generation. So this was not a seamless merging. There were genetic frictions, real biological barriers. The interbreeding was consequential, but it was also constrained. And yet, the genes that did survive were not random. Many of the Neanderthal and Denisovan genes that remain in us are ones that helped. They shaped our immune systems, tuned for the diseases of a cold northern world that our African ancestors had never faced. They affected skin and hair for life under a weaker sun. The Denisovans gave the ancestors of Tibetans a gene that lets them live and breathe at altitudes that would leave the rest of us gasping. And in a twist that lands very close to home, one stretch of Neanderthal DNA carried by many people today has been shown to affect how severely a person responds to the virus behind the corona pandemic. A choice or an encounter made on the Ice Age steppe 47,000 years ago reached forward through time and shaped how some people fared when that pandemic finally came. That is how alive this history is. It is not behind us. It is in us. And the timing of all this has just snapped into focus. Brand new genetic work, published in the last couple of years, has pinned the great wave of Neanderthal interbreeding to a single extended period, beginning around 50,000 years ago and lasting some 7,000 years, ending right around the time the Neanderthals themselves disappear. We met them. We mingled with them for a few thousand years, and then they were gone, and we were the only humans left. Why that happened, why we are alone now, is a haunting question, and we'll face it. But first, we have to follow our own ancestors out of Africa and watch them do the impossible. cross the open sea, and walk into the coldest, emptiest corners of the Ice Age world. Chapter 11. Out of Africa into the Cold. Our story now becomes a journey, the greatest journey our species has ever made. Because everyone alive outside of Africa today descends from a small group of people who, somewhere around 60 to 70,000 years ago, walked out of Africa and never went home. And I want to tell that journey honestly, because the version you may have learned in school, a clean, single, heroic march across the world, has been pulled apart and rebuilt in just the last few years, and the new version is far more interesting. Let me start by killing off a dramatic story you may have heard, because the killing of it tells us something important about who we are. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano called Toba on the island of Sumatra erupted, one of the most colossal eruptions in millions of years, blasting out enough ash to blanket a huge fraction of the Earth. For years, there was a gripping hypothesis, the Toba catastrophe, that this eruption caused a years-long volcanic winter that nearly wiped out humanity, crashing our population down to a few thousand survivors and creating the genetic bottleneck we can still see in our genes. It is a wonderful, terrible story. And it appears to be wrong. The honest thing, the more interesting thing, is what the evidence actually shows. Scientists found a site in Ethiopia with the microscopic glass of Toba's ash in its layers, and they found that the humans living there did not collapse. They carried on. In fact, they seem to have thrived, adapting their hunting and foraging to the drier conditions, possibly taking up the bow and arrow around this very time. Similar evidence has turned up in India and South Africa. Rather than nearly destroying us, Toba seems to have revealed something about us. Our flexibility, our stubborn capacity to adapt to a world turned upside down. We left Africa not because the journey suddenly became easy, but because we had finally become the kind of animal that could survive almost anything. I find that a far more inspiring story than a lucky escape from a volcano. Now the journey itself. The old picture was, leave Africa, sprint across Asia, populate the world. But there's a puzzle in that picture. The genetic evidence says the Great Dispersal happened around 60,000 years ago, but the solid evidence of humans actually established right across Eurasia clusters around 45,000 years ago. There's a gap of some 15,000 years. Where were our ancestors during all that time? A striking idea, published just 2 years ago, proposes an answer, a hub. After leaving Africa, our ancestors did not immediately scatter. They paused for thousands of years in a kind of staging ground, most likely the Persian Plateau, the region around modern Iran, between the Caspian Sea and what was then the exposed bed of the Persian Gulf. There, in a climate that could sustain a sizable population, they waited and grew, and only then radiated outward in great waves, one heading east toward China and Australia, one heading west into Europe, each wave seeding the populations whose descendants are still there today. It is a model still being argued over, because the region is hard to excavate, but it elegantly fills that mysterious gap. Our ancestors lingered at a crossroads before fanning out to inherit the earth. And when they did fan out, what astonishes me most is where they were willing to go. We tend to assume the first modern humans in Europe would have hugged the warm south. They did not. In the last couple of years, beautiful work at a cave in Ranis in Germany has shown that by 45,000 years ago, small bands of Homo sapiens were living far to the north, on open, freezing steppe tundra, in a landscape of reindeer and woolly rhino and cave bear and hyena, with the great ice sheet not so very far away. These were pioneers in the hardest sense, tiny, mobile groups pushing into a brutal subarctic frontier, In a cave they shared with hibernating bears, at the very edge of what a human body can endure. At another site, Barco, Cairo in Bulgaria, the early modern humans were so freshly arrived in Neanderthal country that some of them had a Neanderthal ancestor just 5 or 6 generations back, a Neanderthal great-great-grandparent. These were not conquerors striding into an empty land. They were cold, brave, thinly spread bands of newcomers, intermarrying with the locals, clinging on at the edge of the ice. To survive up there at all required a technology so important that it deserves its own discussion, and we'll get to the needle and the tailored coat. But before we talk about how they survived the cold of the north, I have to take you in the opposite direction, to the warm tropical islands of the southeast, where Ice Age humans did something that, to this day, I find almost impossible to believe they pulled off. Chapter 12: The First Great Voyage. I told you back when we were walking the drowned lands to remember the gap of open ocean between Sunderland and Sahel, between the great continent of Southeast Asia and the fused continent of Australia and New Guinea. I asked you to hold on to it. Now I get to tell you why, and it is, for my money, one of the most thrilling things human beings did in the entire Ice Age. They crossed it. Here is the situation. At the lowest sea level of the Ice Age, you could walk an enormous distance across exposed land, out from the Asian mainland, across Sunderland, all the way to the edge of what is now Bali or Borneo. But then the land stopped and the deep water began. Between the islands of Southeast Asia and the continent of Sahel lay a series of deep ocean channels that never, ever closed, not even at the very lowest tide of the coldest age. To get across to Australia, you had to cross open sea. At the very least, a stretch of around 90 kilometers of open water out of sight of your destination for much of the way. And not just one crossing, a chain of island hops, each one a deliberate voyage across water you could not see the far side of. And human beings did it. We know they did because they got there. The oldest secure evidence for people in Australia, at a rock shelter called Majidbeb in Arnhem Land, on the country of the Murrah people, dates to at least 50,000 years ago, and quite possibly 65,000. Let me put that in perspective. That means human beings were crossing open ocean to reach Australia many thousands of years before our species had even properly settled the cold north of Europe. People were undertaking deliberate sea voyages, building some kind of watercraft, provisioning it, navigating by the stars or the swells or the flight of birds, committing their lives and their children's lives to the open water. At a time when, in the standard story, humans are supposed to have been simple hunter-gatherers. I want to dwell on what that crossing actually required, because it is so easily skated over. It required a boat or a raft seaworthy enough for multiple days at sea, and we have never found one because wood and fiber rot, and the beaches they launched from are now drowned under 100 meters of water. It required navigation, the ability to set out toward a horizon with no visible land, and to believe correctly that there was something out there. It required planning and provisioning, fresh water, food, the cold calculation of how long the journey might take. And it almost certainly required a group, enough people in enough boats to found a viable population on the far side. This was not one lucky raft blown off course. The genetics and the archaeology together suggest repeated, intentional voyaging. These were the first true mariners in human history, and they were doing it more than 50,000 years ago. And once they arrived, they stayed, and they became one of the most genetically distinct and continuous populations on Earth. Aboriginal Australians carry an unbroken connection to that founding voyage stretching back 50,000 years and more, one of the longest continuous cultural lineages anywhere on the planet. They also carry, in their genes, that high fraction of Denisovan DNA we talked about, picked up somewhere along the island route, a molecular souvenir of an encounter with our ghost cousins, carried across the sea into a new continent. And I have to tell you about Lake Mungo, in the dry interior of New South Wales, because it gives this deep antiquity a deeply human face. There, on the shore of a lake that has long since dried to a salt pan, were found the remains of two people who lived around 40,000 years ago, known, with respect to the Aboriginal communities whose ancestors they are, as Mungo Lady and Mungo Man. And what was done with their bodies is extraordinary. Mungo Lady was cremated, carefully, deliberately burned, her remaining bones then crushed and buried. It is the oldest known cremation anywhere in the world. Mungo Man was laid out full length and sprinkled liberally with red ochre, one of the earliest ochre burials we know of. 40,000 years ago, on a continent reached only by sea, people were performing complex, deliberate funeral rituals, treating their dead with ceremony and ochre and fire. They had, in other words, a whole conceptual world, ideas about death, about what a body means, about ritual. That is not primitive. That is us. And in 2017, after long campaigning, Mungo Man's remains were returned to his country and his descendants. A reminder that this is not just ancient history, but living history, belonging to people who are still here. So our species had crossed the open ocean to one new continent. There remained two great continents that no human foot had ever touched, the Americas. And the story of how we got there is the most fiercely contested detective story in all of archaeology. So let me take you to it, and let me finally pay off those footprints I left you with at the very beginning. Chapter 13. The Empty Continents and the Footprints Revisited. Two whole continents, North and South America, joined at the waist, stretching from the Arctic to the freezing tip of Patagonia. Rich, vast, and until astonishingly recently in the human story, completely empty of people. No humans anywhere in the entire Western Hemisphere. And then, at some point near the end of the Ice Age, human beings walked or paddled in, and within what may have been only a few thousand years, spread all the way from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, into two continents full of giant animals that had never seen a human predator before. The peopling of the Americas is the last great chapter of the human colonization of Earth, and almost every part of it is argued over with real ferocity. Let me give you the honest state of the fight, because the fight is the best part. For most of the 20th century, the answer was settled, and it had a name: Clovis. The Clovis people, named for a distinctive, beautifully made fluted spear point first found near Clovis, New Mexico, appeared across North America around 13,000 years ago. They were big game hunters, and their tools turn up at mammoth and bison kill sites. And the story was tidy. The Clovis people were the first Americans who had come down from Beringia through a narrow, ice-free corridor that opened up between the two great ice sheets right around that time, and then swept south. Clovis first. For decades it was almost a religion, and challenging it could end an archaeologist's career. And then the fortress fell. The first serious crack came from a waterlogged site in southern Chile called Monte Verde, excavated by an archaeologist named Tom Dillehay. Because it had been sealed under a peat bog, Monte Verde preserved the kinds of things that almost never survive. Wooden tent frames, knotted cordage, hide, even chewed medicinal seaweed, and a child's footprint. And it dated to around 14,500 years ago, over 1,000 years before Clovis, and 8,000 miles south of the Bering Strait. People were at the bottom of South America before the Clovis culture even existed in the north. The tidy story was broken. And these people were not specialized mammoth hunters. They were generalists, foragers eating seaweed and plants, and a range of animals, which didn't fit the big game hunter image at all. Once the dam broke, more pre-Clovis sites were accepted, and a new model rose to replace the ice-free corridor, the Kelp Highway. The idea is that the first Americans didn't come overland at all, at least not mainly. They came by sea, paddling down the Pacific coast, hugging a near-continuous ribbon of kelp forest, one of the richest ecosystems on Earth, dense with fish and shellfish and sea mammals and seabirds, that ran all the way from Asia, around the rim of the North Pacific, and down the Americas. A coastally adapted, boat-using people could have traveled south along that kelp-fringed shoreline, even while the interior was still locked in ice. The trouble with testing it, of course, is that the Ice Age coastline they traveled is now drowned. 100 meters under the modern sea, those sites are underwater, like Doggerland, like Beringia. The lost lands keep swallowing the evidence. And then there is White Sands. And now I can finally pay off the footprints I opened with. Those trackways, the young person carrying the child, the ground sloth, the mammoth, when they were dated, using seeds from the lake mud, to between 21 and 23,000 years ago, they detonated like a bomb in the field. Because that is not 1,000 years before Clovis. That is 8 or 10,000 years before Clovis, smack in the middle of the last glacial maximum, at a time when the ice sheets were at their largest, when the ice-free corridor was firmly shut, and when even the coastal route was problematic. If those dates are right, there were people in the heart of North America at the very coldest moment of the Ice Age, far earlier than almost anyone thought possible. And here is where I get to keep my promise to be honest with you about the uncertainty, because the uncertainty is the thrill. The dates were immediately, fiercely challenged. The critics had a genuinely good point. The seeds used to date the footprints came from an aquatic plant, and aquatic plants can take up old carbon dissolved in the water, which can make them look thousands of years older than they really are. A real problem. The hard water effect. So the original team went back and dated the layers again, this time using pollen from land plants, which doesn't have that problem, and using a completely separate method based on when buried quartz grains last saw sunlight. They got the same answer, around 22,000 years. Then critics pushed back again. Then, just last year, a third team from labs with no stake in the original work dated the mud itself in 2 independent laboratories, and again got around 21 to 22,000 years. There are now dozens of dates from 3 completely different kinds of material, all pointing to the same astonishing conclusion. Is it settled? No. There are still serious, thoughtful scientists who are not convinced, who point out fairly that there are no tools, no campsites, no other traces of these supposed earliest Americans, just the footprints. And the defenders have a lovely answer. People walking across a mudflat to fetch and carry don't drop their precious tools in the mud, especially when they're far from any source of new stone. They walk light. So the debate goes on, and I love that it goes on, because this is exactly what real science looks like. Not a tidy textbook answer, but a live argument between honest people, with the evidence slowly, grindingly accumulating. My read of where it stands today, the weight of evidence is tilting toward those footprints being real and being Ice Age old, which would mean people were in the Americas during the deepest cold. But the jury is still out, and the most thrilling thing I can tell you is that we genuinely do not yet know the answer to one of the biggest questions about our own past. When exactly the first people reached the last continents. The detective story is still being written. However they got there, and whenever, the people of the Ice Age, north and south, east and west, had to survive a world of brutal cold. So how did they do it? How does a tropical ape from Africa learn to live on the frozen steppe? The answer is one of the great triumphs of human ingenuity, and it starts with something as humble as a needle. Chapter 14: How to Survive the Ice. The Needle, the House of Bones, and the Fire. We are a tropical animal. Strip away our technology and put us out on the Mammoth steppe in winter, and we die in hours. We have no fur, no fat layer to speak of, no claws, no defenses against 40 degrees below freezing. And yet, by the depth of the Ice Age, human beings were not merely surviving on that frozen steppe, they were thriving on it, all the way up into Siberia, in some of the harshest conditions any humans have ever endured. How? Not with our bodies, with our minds. Let me show you the tools that let a naked tropical ape conquer the cold. I want to start with the single most underrated invention in human history, and I mean that seriously. It is the eyed needle, a thin sliver of bone or ivory with a tiny hole carefully drilled through one end. The oldest ones we have are around 30,000 years old, from sites in Russia. And I know a needle sounds trivial next to a spear or a fire. It is not. Before the eyed needle, clothing was crude, hides wrapped around the body and tied on, drafty and loose. The needle changes everything because the needle lets you sew. It lets you cut hides into shaped pieces and stitch them tightly together into fitted, layered, tailored garments, close-fitting tunics, trousers, hooded parkas, maybe even boots and mittens. And tailored clothing, unlike a draped hide, traps a warm layer of still air against the skin. The difference is, quite literally, the difference between life and death in the Arctic. That humble little drilled splinter of bone is what allowed human beings to colonize Siberia. Without the needle, there is no human Beringia, and there are no first Americans. An entire hemisphere was unlocked by the invention of sewing. Then there is the question of weapons, because hunting 6-ton animals with a handheld spear is a good way to get yourself killed. So they invented leverage. The spear thrower, sometimes called by its later name, the atlatl, is a simple wooden or bone shaft that acts as an extension of your arm, hooking the butt of a light spear and effectively lengthening the throwing lever. With one, a hunter could launch a dart at well over 100 kilometers an hour, and crucially, from a safer distance. The oldest one we have, a gorgeous carved piece from France, is over 17,000 years old. And they took this modular thinking further, with composite tools, fitting many small, razor-sharp stone blades into slots along a bone or wooden haft, glued with resin, so that a single weapon carried a dozen replaceable cutting edges. They were, in a real sense, the first engineers, building tools out of multiple specialized parts. And then there is the problem of shelter on a treeless plain, which produced what I think is one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements of the deep past. On the open steppe of Ukraine and Central Europe, there was no wood to build with, so they built with the only large building material available, the animals themselves. At sites like Mezherich in Ukraine, around 18,000 years ago, people constructed dwellings out of mammoth bones. Not a few bones, 100 or more mammoth bones per hut, carefully selected and arranged. Jawbones stacked in herringbone patterns, great curving tusks framing the doorways, the whole heavy framework lashed together and draped with hides, with a hearth burning in the center. Imagine the labor and imagine the sight of it. A village of domed houses built from the skeletons of the largest animals on Earth, smoke rising from the bone roofs on an endless plain of snow. That is one of the indelible images of the Ice Age for me. And inside those shelters, and at the heart of every camp, was fire managed with real sophistication. They built proper hearths, stone-lined, sometimes several in a single dwelling for different tasks. And out on the treeless steppe, where firewood was scarce, they burned mammoth bone, which is greasy with fat and burns hot. The hearth was the gravitational center of life, the place you cooked, made your tools, told your stories, and survived the blizzard. Experiments have shown that a single bone-fueled hearth inside a mammoth bone hut could hold the interior above freezing, even in an Arctic storm. And these were not isolated families clinging on a lone. They lived in bands of perhaps 25 to 50 people, and at certain seasons, multiple bands would gather, 100, 200 people coming together to trade, to find mates, to share news and ritual. And they were connected across staggering distances. Seashells from the Mediterranean turn up hundreds of kilometers inland in Central Europe. Specific kinds of fine stone traveled across whole regions. These trade and social networks may have been one of our species' true secret weapons. And we'll see, when we talk about why the Neanderthals vanished, that the strength of those long-distance human networks may have been exactly the edge that let us survive when they did not. The Ice Age human was not a lone brute in a cave. He or she was a skilled, clothed, networked, deeply social creature, embedded in a web of relationships and exchange that spanned a continent. So they had clothing, weapons, shelter, fire, and society. They had survival. But human beings have never been content with mere survival. Because at exactly this moment, in exactly these cold, hard, dangerous conditions, something erupts in the human record that has nothing to do with staying alive and everything to do with what it means to be us. Art, music, beauty. Let me take you into the cave. Chapter 15. Into the Cave, the Birth of Art. I want you to do something with me. I want you to imagine crawling on your belly through a cold, wet, pitch-black passage deep inside a mountain by the flicker of a single torch made of burning pine. The walls press in. The dark is total beyond your small circle of light. And then the passage opens into a chamber, and you raise your torch, and out of 36,000 years of darkness, an animal looks back at you. That is what happened in December 1994 to three cave explorers in the Ardèche Gorge in southern France, when they squeezed through a sealed passage and found themselves in a chamber that no human being had entered for some 32,000 years. It is called Chauvet Cave, and on its walls are more than 400 animals, painted in charcoal and red ochre by Ice Age people: lions, rhinos, mammoths, bears, horses, bison. And they are not crude. They are masterpieces. The artists understood perspective and shading and movement. There is a panel of lions, drawn so that they seem to surge forward together in a hunt. There are horses with such life in their heads that they could have been drawn yesterday. This is among the oldest painted art we know, and it is already, fully, completely art. That single fact overturned a whole comfortable assumption. People used to imagine that art evolved, that it began crude and simple and got better over the millennia. Chauvet says no. At 36,000 years ago, at nearly the very beginning of the European record, the art is already a triumph. The capacity was there, fully formed from the start. And Chauvet is only one of a constellation. There is Lascaux in France, perhaps 17,000 years old, with its Hall of the Bulls, where a single painted aurochs runs more than 5 meters across the wall, the largest figure in all of Ice Age art. There is Altamira in Spain, whose sealing of bison was so accomplished that when an amateur and his little daughter first reported it in the 1870s, the scientific establishment denounced it as a hoax. They simply could not believe that Ice Age people could have made something so beautiful, and they hounded the man who found it. He died disbelieved. It was only vindicated decades later, after his death, when more painted caves were found. I tell you that story because it is a recurring shape in this whole field. Again and again, we have underestimated Ice Age people, and again, the evidence has forced us to grant them their full humanity. And here is the part of the cave art story that thrills me most, because it shatters another comfortable assumption: the idea that this creative explosion was a European event, a special thing that happened in the caves of France and Spain. It was not. On the island of Sulawesi, in Indonesia, painted on a cave wall, is a scene of small human-like figures interacting with a wild pig, and it has been dated to at least 51,000 years ago, older than anything in Europe. It is the oldest known storytelling picture in the world. The impulse to paint, to represent, to tell a story on a wall was being exercised in tropical Southeast Asia thousands of years before Chauvet. Art is not European. Art is human. It traveled with us wherever we went. Now, what does it mean? Why did people who lived on the absolute edge of survival, in a freezing and dangerous world, crawl deep into the most dangerous and useless places they could find, the black hearts of caves, far from daylight, far from anywhere you would live, to paint animals on the walls by torchlight? Nobody knows for certain, and I want to be honest about the leading ideas and honest that they are guesses. One influential theory holds that the art is bound up with shamanism, that the caves were portals to a spirit world, and the paintings record visions seen in trance states, the geometric patterns matching the very patterns the human brain generates in altered consciousness. It is a powerful idea, and some of the evidence fits beautifully. It is also, frankly, almost impossible to prove or disprove, and you should be a little wary of any theory that can explain absolutely anything. Others think the images were hunting magic, or markers of identity, or teaching, or simply the irrepressible human need to make beautiful things. The truth is we do not know what these paintings meant to the people who made them, and we probably never fully will. And here, the not knowing is part of the encounter. You are standing in front of a message from a mind 36,000 years gone, and you can feel that it meant something enormous, and you cannot read it. That ache is real. There is one more thing in those caves, and it is the one that gets me every time, the handprints. All over the world, in cave after cave, Ice Age people pressed a hand to the rock and blew pigment around it, leaving a stencil, the negative image of a human hand. Sometimes adult, sometimes child-sized, and there is no message harder to misread than that. Across 40,000 years, a person reached out, pressed their hand to the stone, and left the mark that says the oldest thing any human has ever said. I was here. I existed. I am like you. You can stand in a cave today and place your own hand against the stencil of a hand left by someone who lived in the depths of the Ice Age, and the two hands are the same size, the same shape. That is contact across deep time. That is the whole reason I tell these stories. And it was not only painting. They made music. In the same region of Germany that gave us some of the oldest figurines, archaeologists found flutes, real playable flutes, carved from bird bone and mammoth ivory, around 40,000 years old, with carefully drilled finger holes. People made replicas and played them, and they produce clear, haunting musical notes. Think about that. 40,000 years ago, in a freezing world full of giants and danger, in the firelight of a cave, somebody was playing music. The fire, the painted walls, the music in the dark. We were already completely ourselves. And if they made art and music, they also confronted the deepest questions about death and meaning and what lies beyond. So let me take you to the grave. Chapter 16. The Beads, the Lion Man, and the First Questions. I want to take you to a place called Sungia, on the cold plain of what is now Russia, about 130 miles east of Moscow. Around 34,000 years ago, in the depths of the Ice Age, somebody died there and was buried, and the burial they were given is one of the most astonishing things ever found from the human past. I have read the descriptions of it many times, and it still stops me. In one grave lay an older man. In another, side by side, head to head, lay two children, a boy of perhaps 12 or 13 and a girl a little younger. And they were not simply laid in the ground. They were covered head to foot in beads, thousands of them. each one a tiny disc carved from mammoth ivory, drilled through and sewn onto their clothing, onto caps, tunics, trousers, footwear, so that the garments must have glittered from head to toe. On the bodies of those two children alone, archaeologists counted something like 10,000 ivory beads. The boy wore a belt strung with the canine teeth of Arctic foxes, and each fox has only two such teeth, which means dozens of foxes were hunted for a single belt. He had an enormous lance carved from a single mammoth tusk, straightened, and I want you to sit with that, because we do not actually know how Ice Age people straightened a curved mammoth tusk into a straight spear. It should not be possible with the technology we think they had, and yet there it is. Now here is the detail that turns this from a beautiful object into a window into the mind. Somebody made those beads, and when modern researchers sat down and carved replica beads with the tools of the time, they found that a single bead took something like an hour to make. 10,000 beads. Do the arithmetic with me slowly. That is roughly 10,000 hours of skilled labor sewn onto the bodies of two children. Years of work, the better part of a working lifetime, gathered up and put into the ground, buried, given to the dead, taken out of the world of the living forever. People who lived on a knife edge of survival, who could not waste a calorie, chose to spend years of effort to honor their dead and then bury that effort in the frozen earth. You cannot do that unless you believe something. You do not lavish years of labor on a corpse and then hide it underground unless, somewhere in your mind, the dead still matter, unless you believe or hope or fear that the person is going somewhere or watching or owed something. Grave goods are the fingerprints of belief, and the beads of Sungir are, to me, among the oldest fingerprints of the human soul that we have ever found. These were not brutes scratching out an existence. These were people with funerals. And Sungir is not alone. Travel west and back a little in time to Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, around 30,000 years ago. There, archaeologists found a grave with three young people buried together, and the arrangement is strange and haunting. The one in the middle appears, from the bones, to have had a physical deformity. The two on either side were laid with their hands reaching toward that central figure, toward the pelvis. One of them was buried face down. Their heads were surrounded with ochre, the red pigment, and there were ivory and tooth ornaments. We do not know what happened there. Was it a family, a ritual, a tragedy? The grave is a sentence in a language we cannot read, but you can feel that it is a sentence, that it means something, that it was arranged with intention and care and probably grief. And at that same site, Dolní Věstonice, we find something else that rewrites the textbooks. Little figures, animals, and a famous small female figure modeled out of clay and bone ash and deliberately fired in a kiln. They are the oldest known fired ceramics anywhere in the world. And here is the thing that makes me grin. They did not use this technology to make pots. Pottery, the practical use, comes tens of thousands of years later. The very first thing human beings did with the chemistry of firing clay was not to make a useful container. It was to make art. The figurine often shattered in the kiln, and there are signs the makers may have wanted it to, that the explosion of the figure in the fire was the point, was the ritual. The first ceramic technology on Earth was invented in the service of meaning, not utility. We made magic before we made crockery. Now let me show you my single favorite object in all of Ice Age art, and one of the most important objects in the entire human story. It was found in a cave called Hohenstein-Stadel in Germany, in pieces, hundreds of fragments of carved mammoth ivory, scattered and overlooked for decades before anyone reassembled them. When they finally did, they had a statue about a foot tall, around 40,000 years old. And it is a figure with the body of a standing human and the head of a lion. We call it the Lion Man. Stop and feel the weight of that. The Lion Man is a being that does not exist. Nobody ever saw a lion-headed man and carved what they saw. Somebody had to imagine it, to hold in their mind the idea of a lion and the idea of a human, and fuse them into a third thing that exists only in thought, and then spend, by modern reconstruction, something like 300 to 400 hours carving that imaginary being out of ivory with stone tools. 400 hours in the Ice Age, devoted to making real a creature that lives only in the mind. That is the birth of the imagination made solid. That is mythology, religion, fiction, the supernatural, the entire human capacity to believe in things that are not physically present, captured in a single object, 40,000 years old. When I say we were already completely ourselves, the lion man is what I mean. A species that carves its gods in ivory is a species with an inner life as rich and strange as yours. And then there are the figures we call the Venus figurines, small carved women, found across an astonishing range, from France all the way to Siberia, made over many thousands of years. The most famous, the so-called Venus of Willendorf, is around 25 to 30,000 years old, a palm-sized woman with full breasts and belly and hips, and a head with no face but a careful pattern, perhaps of braided hair or a woven cap. People argue endlessly about what they meant: fertility symbols, self-portraits, goddesses, good luck charms, depictions of real women, or something we have no word for. And again, I am going to be honest with you, we do not know. But notice the pattern. Across thousands of miles and thousands of years, people who never met were making the same kind of object. There was a shared symbolic world stretching across the whole frozen continent. An idea you could carry in your hand from France to Russia and have it still mean something. That is culture, full-blown, deep in the Ice Age. So when did religion begin? You will not get a date from me because there is no first moment, no single fossil that says here is where belief switched on. But if you ask me where I see the unmistakable signs of the religious mind, the burial of the dead with care and treasure, the imagining of beings that do not exist, the making of symbols that everyone agrees to share, then the answer is deep inside the Ice Age, tens of thousands of years ago, in the cold and the dark. The questions that every religion since has tried to answer: what happens when we die? What are the powers behind the world? Why are we here? Those questions were already being asked by people in fur, by firelight, with the wind howling outside. We have never not been asking them. And that, to me, is one of the most moving facts in this entire story. The oldest thing about us, older than farming, older than cities, older than writing, is that we look at death and we refuse to accept that it is simply the end. Now, I have been telling you about us, about our species, our art, our grave, our gods. But for most of this story, we were not the only humans on Earth. There was another kind of person sharing the Ice Age world with us, and we have spent 150 years getting them wrong. It is time to meet the Neanderthals properly. Chapter 17. The Other Humans Meeting the Neanderthals. Let me tell you how badly we have treated the Neanderthals, because the story of our changing opinion of them is really a story about us. When the first good Neanderthal skeleton was studied, in France in the early 1900s, the scientist who reconstructed it gave the world the image that has haunted them ever since. A stooped, shuffling, brutish creature, knees bent, head thrust forward, more ape than man, the very picture of the dim-witted caveman. That reconstruction became the Neanderthal in every cartoon and every insult. Call someone a Neanderthal and you know exactly what you mean: stupid, primitive, a thug. There was only one problem. The skeleton he reconstructed was an old man, riddled with arthritis. The stoop was disease, not anatomy. A healthy Neanderthal stood as upright as you do. It took decades to undo the damage of that one mistake, and in some ways we never have. So let me try to give them back to you as they really were, because the truth is far more interesting, and in places it will break your heart. The Neanderthals were not our ancestors. They were our cousins, a separate kind of human who split from our lineage perhaps 500,000 years ago, and then evolved in Europe and Western Asia, while our own ancestors evolved in Africa. They were built for the cold and built for power, shorter than us on average, but broader, heavier boned, immensely strong, with a deep barrel chest and a large nose that may have warmed and moistened the freezing air. And here is the fact people find hardest to swallow. Their brains were, on average, as large as ours. Slightly larger, even. Whatever made our species different in the end, it was not raw brain size. The Neanderthals were not stupid. What did they do? They survived in Ice Age Europe for something like 300,000 years. Far, far longer than our own kind has yet managed there. Think about that before you call them failures. They made sophisticated stone tools with a technique that requires you to plan the whole sequence of strikes in advance. They were apex hunters who took on enormous, dangerous animals at close range with thrusting spears, and their skeletons show it, healed fractures all over their bodies, the same pattern of injury you see in modern rodeo riders, the marks of a life spent grappling with huge beasts. They used fire. They made glue from birch bark, which requires controlled high-temperature distillation, a genuinely difficult bit of chemistry. They wore clothing, used pigments, and they may have made art. In several Spanish caves, there are red painted symbols and hand stencils that have been dated, controversially, to before our species is thought to have arrived in the region, which would mean Neanderthal hands made them. The debate is fierce and not settled, and I will not pretend it is. But the very fact that it is a serious debate tells you how far we have come from the shuffling brute. And then there is Shanidar Cave, in the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, which holds the discovery that, more than any other, made me love them. In that cave were the remains of several Neanderthals, and one of them, an older man we call Shanidar I, tells an extraordinary story in his bones. He had suffered a catastrophic series of injuries, probably years before he died. A crushing blow to the side of his head that likely blinded him in one eye. A withered, useless right arm, possibly amputated below the elbow. Damage to his leg and foot that would have left him lame. This was a one-eyed, one-armed, limping old man. And he lived. For years after injuries that should have killed him, he went on living. He could not have hunted. He could barely have fed or defended himself, which means that someone else fed him. Someone shared meat with a man who could not contribute. Someone tolerated and protected and cared for a broken old person, year after year, for no advantage that we can measure. That is compassion. That is a community that does not abandon its weak. And it was happening among the people we named as the byword for brutishness, in a cave in the mountains, tens of thousands of years ago. I have to be honest with you about one of the most famous Neanderthal stories, though, because honesty is the whole game here. At that same cave, Shanidar, clumps of ancient pollen were found around one of the burials, and for decades the world was told a beautiful story. The flower burial, a Neanderthal laid to rest on a bed of wildflowers by mourners who climbed the hills to gather blossoms for their dead. It is gorgeous. I desperately want it to be true. But careful later work suggested the pollen may well have been carried into the grave by burrowing rodents, a kind of gerbil that stashes flower heads in its tunnels rather than by grieving Neanderthals. So I will not sell you the flowers as fact. What I will tell you is that the Neanderthals at Shanidar do seem to have deliberately placed their dead in that cave, returning to it as a place for the dead over a long time, and that the cared-for old man is as solid as bone. The flowers are a maybe. The compassion is real. So here is where we land. The Neanderthals were intelligent, powerful, resourceful, enduring people who cared for one another and buried their dead, and very possibly made art and symbols. They were not a failed rough draft of humanity. They were a fully realized kind of human being, as much at home in the Ice Age world as we were, more so, for far longer. And we know from the last few chapters that when our kind finally moved into their world, we did not simply pass them by. We met them, we had children with them. Their blood is in most of the people listening to this. They are not entirely gone, they are partly us. Which leaves the hardest question in this whole episode, the one I have been circling and must now face directly. If they were so capable, if they survived for 300,000 years, if they were not stupid and not weak, then why are they gone? Why is there only one kind of human left on Earth, when for almost all of our history there were several? Pull your chair in close, because the honest answer is more unsettling and more interesting than the story you have probably been told. Chapter 18. Why are we the only ones left? For a long time, the story we told about the end of the Neanderthals was simple and flattering to us. We arrived, smarter and better armed, and we wiped them out, outcompeted them, or massacred them, drove them off the good land and into the last cold corners of Europe, and watched them die. A clean tale of the superior people replacing the inferior ones. It is the story our species tends to like, because we are the hero of it. I do not think it is true. Or rather, I think the truth is so much more tangled and so much less flattering that it deserves to be told properly. Because the disappearance of the Neanderthals is not a murder mystery with a single killer. It is a death by 1,000 cuts, and the more we learn, the harder it becomes to point at any one cause and say, that is what did it. Let me lay out the suspects. Start with the climate, because the Neanderthals died in a brutal and unstable stretch of the Ice Age. This was not a steadily cold world, it lurched. There were episodes called Heinrich events, when armadas of icebergs broke off the great ice sheets and poured into the North Atlantic, and the climate of Europe convulsed savage cold, drought, the landscape flipping between forest and frozen steppe faster than a population could comfortably adapt. One of these, around 40,000 years ago, falls right in the window when the Neanderthals were vanishing. For a people specialized to particular landscapes and particular prey, a climate that kept yanking the rug out could have shattered their world piece by piece. Add a second blow. Around 39 to 40,000 years ago, a gigantic volcano erupted near what is now Naples, in Italy, an eruption so large we call its deposit the Campanian ignimbrite. It blanketed much of Eastern Europe in ash and would have poisoned the air and chilled the climate further across exactly the region where the last Neanderthals were clinging on. It did not fall on empty land. It fell on their land. Now add the quietest and perhaps the deadliest factor of all, and it is not violence, it is loneliness. When we read the Neanderthal genome, we find the signature of small, scattered, isolated populations, low genetic diversity, inbreeding, bands that did not connect with one another across great distances the way our own networks did. And here, I think, is the real edge our species had: not bigger brains, not better spears, but better social wiring. We traded over hundreds of miles. We carried shells from distant seas deep inland. We maintained webs of contact that let useful ideas and useful goods and, crucially, useful mates flow between groups. When one of our bands hit catastrophe, the network could refill it. The Neanderthals seem to have lived in smaller, more isolated pockets. In a stable world that is survivable. In a world of climate lurches and volcanic winters, a small, isolated population that takes a hard hit simply blinks out, with no neighbors to refill it. They may have been killed less by us than by isolation. And then there is the gentlest extinction of all, and the strangest to think about: absorption. We did not only replace the Neanderthals, we interbred with them. Every time a Neanderthal had a child with one of us, and that child grew up among our larger, denser population, a little of the Neanderthal line was, in effect, folded into ours. Run that over thousands of years, with their numbers shrinking and ours growing, and you get what geneticists call swamping. A small population that keeps marrying into a vastly larger one does not always die out in blood and violence. Sometimes it simply dissolves, its genes diluted generation by generation until there is no separate people left, only a faint inheritance scattered through the survivors. Part of why there are no Neanderthals is that they became, in a small but literal way, us. So which was it? The climate, the volcano, the isolation, the swamping, the competition with us for the same animals and the same caves. And here is my honest answer, the one the evidence actually supports, all of them. Not one cause, but a convergence. Picture a people already thinned and scattered into small, inbred bands, already strained by a violently unstable climate, hit by a continent-burying volcanic eruption, now sharing their hunting grounds with a new kind of human who came in larger and better connected numbers and who married into what remained of them. No single one of those might have finished them. Together, over a few thousand years, they were enough. The last traces of the Neanderthals we can find are from around 40,000 years ago in the south and west of Europe, the far corners. And then the bones stop, and the only kind of human left in the world is ours. I want to resist the easy moral here because there are two, and they are both too neat. One is the triumphant one: we won, we were better. I have just spent a whole chapter explaining why I do not believe that is what happened. But the other easy moral is the guilty one: we are murderers, genocide is in our nature. I do not think the evidence supports that either. There is no layer of slaughtered Neanderthals, no archaeological massacre. What there is something quieter and more humbling. Two kinds of people met in a harsh and shifting world, and one of them, already fragile, did not make it through, while the other, by luck and numbers and the strength of its connections, did. It could very nearly have gone the other way. There were long stretches when our own species teetered on the edge of vanishing too. And so we are alone. For the first time in the entire history of our lineage, there is only one kind of human on the planet. For millions of years, the Earth held several kinds of upright, tool-making, fire-using people at once. Now there is just us, and we are so used to it that we cannot imagine anything else. We think one human species is the natural order of things. It is not. It is a very recent and very strange situation, and it is the result of the long, sad, complicated story I have just told you. The next time you feel lonely as a species, looking out at the cosmos for company, remember that we once had company right here, walking the same valleys, sharing our fires and our children, and we are the ones who are left to remember them. Now the world itself is about to change beneath everyone's feet, because the great cold that made all of this, the steppe, the giants, the land bridges, the separate peoples, is not going to last. The ice is about to melt, and the way it melts is far more violent and far stranger than the slow thaw you are probably imagining. Chapter 19: The Great Thaw. I think most of us, when we picture an ice age ending, imagine something gentle and gradual. The sun growing a little warmer each year, the glaciers quietly shrinking back, a slow and stately retreat over the ages until one morning the world is simply green again. Put that picture out of your mind. The end of the last ice age was not gentle. It was one of the most dramatic, chaotic, violent transformations the planet has been through in the whole span of the human story, and it happened, in places, with terrifying speed. Let me first tell you what set it off, because it is the very thing I described to you chapters ago: the slow clockwork in the sky. Around 20,000 years ago, the great ice sheets were at their maximum, mountains of ice up to 2 miles thick, sitting on top of Canada and northern Europe. And then the orbital cycles, the wobble and tilt and stretch of the Earth's path around the sun, shifted so that the northern summers began, very slowly, to receive a little more sunlight. That nudge alone would not have done much. But the Earth does not just respond to a nudge, it amplifies it through what we call feedbacks, and the feedbacks are where the drama lives. Here is the most important one. Ice is white, and white reflects sunlight straight back out to space. So a world covered in ice stays cold by bouncing the sun's heat away. But melt a little of that ice and you expose the dark ground or the dark ocean underneath, and dark surfaces drink the sunlight in and warm and melt more ice, which exposes more dark surface, which absorbs more heat. Once it starts, it feeds itself. We call it the albedo feedback, and it is a runaway. Add a second one. As the world warmed, carbon dioxide came out of the warming oceans into the air, and carbon dioxide is a heat-trapping gas, so more of it meant more warming, which drove out more of it. The orbital nudge was just the trigger. The feedbacks were the explosion. The planet flipped, over thousands of years, from a self-sustaining cold state into a self-sustaining warm one. And as those colossal ice sheets melted, they did something to the sea that is almost impossible to take in. Remember that all that ice was made of ocean water, lifted out of the sea and stacked on the land as frozen mountains. As it melted, it ran back to the sea, and the sea began to rise not by inches over centuries, but at times catastrophically. There was an episode we call Meltwater Pulse 1A, around 14,500 years ago, when the sea rose so fast that the best estimates put it at something like 20 meters, 60 feet, in the space of just a few centuries. Let me put that in human terms. That is the sea climbing the height of a 6- or 7-story building, fast enough that a person could watch the coastline of their childhood drown within their own lifetime. Watch the beaches and the river mouths and the good flat hunting land go under. Generation after generation forced to move inland, the map of the world being redrawn faster than the stories could keep up. This is the drowning of Doggerland I told you about, the swallowing of Beringia, the breaking of the bridge to the Americas, the cutting of Tasmania and Britain from their mainlands, all of it, the great reshaping of the coastlines of the earth, happening in this churning, violent thaw. Whole landscapes where people had lived and hunted for thousands of years went under the waves. I am convinced that the flood myths found in so many cultures around the world, the deep, near-universal human memory of a time when the waters rose and swallowed the land, carry, in some form, the echo of this. People really did watch the sea eat the world. They were not wrong. But I have saved the strangest part of the thaw for last, and it is the part that turns this whole story on its head, because the warming did not run smoothly to its finish. Right in the middle of it, with the world well on its way to becoming warm and green, something went catastrophically wrong, and the climate slammed backwards, plunged, in places within a single human lifetime, back into bitter, full glacial cold, and held there for more than 1,000 years before flipping warm again just as fast. It is the single most dramatic climate event in the human story. It nearly undid everything. We call it the Younger Dryas, and what happened during it, and the wild and famous theories about what caused it, are where we go next. Because hidden inside the Younger Dryas is both a genuine scientific detective story and one of the most seductive false theories of our age, which I am going to take apart for you piece by piece. Chapter 20. The 1,000-Year Winter. Let me give you the scale of what happened first, because it is hard to believe even when you know the evidence is rock solid. The ice cores from Greenland, those frozen diaries I told you about, where each year leaves a layer you can read, record the temperature of the past with extraordinary precision. And in those cores, right at the point we are talking about, around 12,900 years ago, the temperature does not drift downward. It falls off a cliff. In parts of the North Atlantic region, the climate dropped by something like 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, and the cause suggests this savage cooling happened at its sharpest within a matter of decades, possibly within a single human lifetime. A child could have been born into a warming, greening world, and grown old in a world plunged back into the deep freeze. That is the younger Dryas. The name, by the way, comes from a little Arctic wildflower, the mountain avens Dryas, whose pollen suddenly reappears in European bogs at this time because the cold-loving tundra plants came flooding back south as the warmth was ripped away. The forests that had begun to spread retreated. The glaciers, which had been melting, surged forward again. And it held, this returned winter, for more than 1,000 years before ending as abruptly as it began. Now, how on earth does a warming planet suddenly throw itself back into an ice age for 1,000 years and then snap out of it? This is a real mystery, and unraveling it gave us one of the most important ideas in all of climate science, an idea that, frankly, should make every one of us pay attention to the world right now. So let me walk you through the detective work, because it is beautiful. The key is the ocean. The Atlantic Ocean is not a still bath. It is a vast, moving conveyor belt of water. Warm, salty water flows north near the surface. This is the current that includes the Gulf Stream, carrying tropical heat up toward Europe and the Arctic. As that water travels north, it gives up its heat to the air, which is a large part of why northwestern Europe is so much milder than it has any right to be for its latitude. And as it cools, this salty water grows dense and heavy, and in the far North Atlantic it sinks, plunging into the deep ocean and flowing back south along the bottom. That sinking is the engine. It is what pulls the whole conveyor along. The warm water flows north because the cold, dense water is sinking and dragging the belt forward. Now here is the vulnerability, and it is a knife edge. That engine runs on the water being salty enough to sink. Make the northern water too fresh, dilute it with enough fresh water, and it stops being dense enough to sink. And if it stops sinking, the engine stalls. The conveyor weakens or shuts down. The warm current stops flowing north, and the heat that current was delivering to the North Atlantic and to Europe simply stops arriving. The region freezes fast. So what dumped a vast slug of fresh water into the North Atlantic right at the moment the younger Dryas began? And here is the leading answer, and I love it because it ties the whole story together. Remember the great ice sheet melting off North America? In front of that retreating ice sat an enormous lake of meltwater, dammed by the ice itself, a body of fresh water bigger than any lake on Earth today, which we call Lake Agassiz. And the leading explanation is that around 12,900 years ago, that ice dam broke. The lake burst its bounds and emptied a colossal flood of fresh water into the sea. That fresh water spread across the North Atlantic, capped it, stopped the salty water from sinking, and stalled the conveyor. The warm current shut off. Europe froze. The Ice Age came back. I want to be honest, because honesty is the whole point of how I tell these stories. The exact details are still argued over. Some researchers think the flood went east down toward the Atlantic. Others think it drained northwest through what is now the Mackenzie River into the Arctic. The precise plumbing is debated. But the core idea that a sudden flood of fresh meltwater shut down the ocean's heat conveyor and flipped the climate is well supported and widely accepted, and it teaches us something that I cannot stress enough. It teaches us that the climate is not always a gentle dial that turns smoothly up and down. It has switches. It has tipping points, thresholds, where a small push produces a sudden, enormous, self-locking change that you cannot easily undo. Push the system a little too far, and it does not respond a little. It flips. Hold on to that idea. We are going to need it painfully before this episode is done. And the end of the younger Dryas drives the lesson home. After more than 1,000 years, the conveyor restarted, perhaps as the great flood of fresh water finally flushed out, and the salt returned, and the engine kicked back into life, and the warmth came back just as fast as it had left. The ice cores show the temperature leaping back up, 10 degrees or so, again within a human lifetime. The world snapped from glacial back to warm in the space of a generation, and this time it stayed warm. That snap, around 11,700 years ago, is the true end of the last ice age and the beginning of the warm, stable world we still live in, the world in which everything you think of as human history would shortly unfold. So that is the real story of the younger Dryas, a meltwater flood, a stalled ocean, a thousand-year winter, and a lesson about tipping points written in ice. It is a genuine scientific triumph, pieced together from cores and lake beds and ancient pollen. But it is not the story you may have heard, because there is another explanation for the younger Dryas, a far more dramatic, far more cinematic one, involving a comet from space, exploding fireballs, and a lost advanced civilization, and it has been watched by tens of millions of people and sold in best-selling books. And I am now going to take it apart, carefully and fairly, because how we tell the difference between a thrilling story and a true one is, in the end, what this whole episode is about. Chapter 21: The Comet That Wasn't. Here is the seductive version. About 12,900 years ago, the story goes, a comet, or a swarm of fragments from one, struck or exploded over North America. The impact unleashed continent-wide firestorms, threw up enough debris to darken the sky and chill the planet, triggered the younger Dryas freeze, wiped out the great Ice Age animals like the mammoths, and destroyed a sophisticated early human culture, all in one apocalyptic blow. It is called the younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and in its most popular form, in books that have sold in the millions, it goes further. It claims there was a lost advanced civilization, wiped from the earth by this cataclysm, and that mainstream archaeology is too arrogant or too cowardly to admit it. I understand completely why people love this story. It has everything: fire from the sky, a global catastrophe, a lost golden age, and a band of brave outsiders fighting a closed-minded establishment. It is a fantastic story. I have to tell you with as much care as I can that the evidence says it almost certainly did not happen. And I want to show you how we know, because the how is more valuable than the verdict. The impact hypothesis rests mainly on a set of physical clues its supporters say they find in a thin layer of sediment dating to the start of the younger Dryas, tiny spherules of melted rock, microscopic diamonds called nanodiamonds, traces of metals like platinum, and bits of charcoal that they read as the ash of continent-wide fires. At first glance, it sounds impressive. So scientists did what science is supposed to do. They tried to check it. And this is where it falls apart. First, the reproducibility problem. When independent teams went to the sites and tried to find the same telltale markers in the same layers, again and again, they could not reproduce the results, or they found that the supposed impact markers were not actually confined to that one moment in time at all, that you could find similar spherules and particles in layers from many different periods, which means they are not the fingerprint of a unique cosmic event. A clue that shows up everywhere is a clue to nothing. Second, the markers turned out to have ordinary explanations. The little spherules can be formed by ordinary processes, even by modern contamination. The nanodiamond's claims did not hold up well under independent scrutiny. The charcoal and the supposed continent-wide fire layer, when examined carefully, the evidence for a single synchronized continental inferno simply was not there. The burning signals were the ordinary, scattered wildfires you find throughout the record, not one global blaze. Third, and to me this is close to fatal, there is no crater and no date that fits. A comet impact big enough to do all of this should leave a mark, a crater, a definite global debris layer, something unmistakable in the geological record worldwide, and it is not there. A few years ago, supporters pointed excitedly at a large crater discovered under the ice of Greenland as the smoking gun. But when that crater was carefully dated, it turned out to be not 12,000 years old, but millions of years old. It had nothing to do with the younger Dryas at all. The smoking gun was firing in the wrong epoch entirely. And then there is the argument from the sky itself, which I find quietly devastating. For a comet of the required size to hit the Earth at exactly this moment is, by the ordinary statistics of how often such objects strike our planet, wildly improbable. Impacts of that scale are separated, on average, by spans of time vastly longer than the entire history of our species. To invoke one at precisely the moment we already have a perfectly good, well-evidenced explanation, the meltwater flood and the stalled ocean, is to reach for the rarest possible cause when a well-understood one is sitting right in front of you. A few years ago, a large group of scientists, more than a dozen specialists from across the relevant fields, published a detailed, point-by-point refutation, going through the impact hypothesis claim by claim and showing where each one failed. The scientific consensus is clear. The younger Dryas was caused by the reorganization of the oceans and the ice, not by a comet. There is no good evidence for the impact, and there is certainly no evidence whatsoever for a lost advanced civilization. No city, no technology, no tools, no farms, no writing, nothing. Absence of a thing that grand, across a whole planet we have dug up extensively, is not a cover-up. It is just absence. Now, why have I spent a whole chapter on a theory I am telling you is wrong? Not to mock anyone, the impulse to wonder, to ask whether the official story is the whole story, is healthy, and I share it. I have spent this episode delighting in the times the establishment was wrong about Altamira, about Monte Verde, about the Neanderthals. So let me be fair to the other side. Science has been wrong before, and the lone dissenter has sometimes turned out to be right. That is true, and it is why we test ideas instead of voting on them. But here is the difference, and it is everything. The cases where the outsider won, Altamira, Monte Verde, they won because the evidence eventually came down on their side. They were vindicated by digging, by dating, by data. The impact hypothesis has had its turn at bat, for years, with many people genuinely trying to confirm it, and the evidence has come down hard on the other side. That is the real lesson, and it is the beating heart of this whole episode. The goal is not to believe the exciting story, and it is not to believe the boring story either. The goal is to follow the evidence, wherever it leads, to be willing to be thrilled by a comet, and then to give the comet up when the rocks say no. The true story of the younger Dryas, the stalled ocean and the thousand-year winter, is every bit as dramatic as the comet. It just has the additional, unglamorous virtue of being what actually happened. And learning to love the true story more than the exciting one is the most important skill I could ever hope to leave you with. Now the comet did not kill the mammoths, but something did. Across the world, as the Ice Age ended, the great beasts, the giants I walked you among near the start of this journey, vanished, almost all of them, in what is one of the largest and most haunting extinctions in the history of life. And the question of what killed them points its finger uncomfortably, partly at us. Chapter 22. The Death of the Giants. Cast your mind back to the Mammoth Steppe, to the walk I took you on among the giants, the woolly mammoths and the woolly rhinos, the giant ground sloths as big as elephants, the cave bears and cave lions, the saber-toothed cats, the colossal armored glyptodonts of the Americas, the 2-ton wombat-like creatures of Australia, the giant deer with antlers 12 feet across. That world, teeming with enormous animals, was real, and people lived in it for tens of thousands of years. And then, as the Ice Age ended, it emptied. Across continent after continent, the great majority of the largest land animals went extinct. The giants died, and the world we live in now, a world strangely poor in enormous land mammals, is the aftermath of that dying. What killed them? This is one of the oldest and fiercest arguments in the whole study of the Ice Age, and I am going to give you both sides honestly, because I genuinely think the truth lies in the tension between them. On one side is the climate explanation. The end of the Ice Age was, as you now know, a time of violent upheaval, the warming, the chaotic thaw, the drowning coastlines, the younger Dryas slamming the world back into cold and then releasing it. The great Mammoth steppe, that vast productive grassland, broke apart as the climate changed. In many places it gave way to forest or to soggy tundra that could not feed the same teeming herds. Animals exquisitely adapted to a cold, dry, grassy world found that world dissolving beneath them. By this account, the giants died because their habitat died. On the other side is the explanation that points at us. We call it the ovical hypothesis, and the pattern that drives it is genuinely unsettling. Look at the timing of these extinctions around the world, and over, the great die-off of the big animals seems to follow close behind one event, the arrival of human beings. In Australia, the giant marsupials vanish not long after people arrive, tens of thousands of years ago. In the Americas, the mammoths and the giant sloths and the rest collapse in the few thousand years after humans sweep down through the continents. The big, slow-breeding animals, the ones that had never seen a creature like us and had no instinct to fear us, the ones that took years to raise a single calf and so could not replace their losses quickly, those are exactly the ones that died. Island by island, continent by continent, the giants tend to disappear after we show up. That is not nothing. That is a fingerprint. So which is it, the climate or us? And here, as with the Neanderthals, my honest answer is that the argument itself may be the wrong shape, because the most likely answer is both. Picture the giants squeezed from two sides at once. Their world is being torn apart by the most violent climate swings in ages, and at the very same time, for the first time in their existence, a new and tireless predator is hunting them, a predator that cooperates, that uses spears and traps and fire, that does not need to fear them. An animal population can often survive a changing climate. It can often survive a new predator. Both at once, hitting the large, slow-breeding species hardest, may have been the squeeze that finished them. The climate loaded the gun, and we, in many places, may have helped pull the trigger. The proportions differ from continent to continent, and people will argue the balance for another century. But the synergy, the deadly overlap of a collapsing world and a new hunter is, I think, the closest thing we have to the truth. And the timing offers one more clue that I find quietly damning, because it is a kind of natural experiment. Africa, where animals and humans evolved together over millions of years, where the great beasts had the time to learn to fear us as we slowly became dangerous, Africa kept most of its giants. The elephants, the rhinos, the hippos, the giraffes, they are the survivors, the last great megafauna, and they survived in the one place where the animals grew up alongside us. It is the places where we arrived suddenly, as a fully formed deadly predator dropping in on animals that had never learned to run from us, that lost their giants fastest. That contrast is hard to explain by climate alone. Now let me leave you with two images from the very end of the giants because they haunt me and I think they will haunt you. The first is Wrangel Island, a remote scrap of land in the Arctic Ocean off the coast of Siberia. The mammoths of the mainland died out roughly 10,000 years ago. But on Wrangel Island, a small population of woolly mammoths survived, cut off, marooned, long after the rest of their kind were gone. How long? They were still there, still alive, around 4,000 years ago. I want you to really hold that date. 4,000 years ago, the pyramids of Egypt had already been standing for centuries. The Sumerians, whose story I have told you elsewhere, had already built their cities and invented writing. There were living, breathing woolly mammoths on this earth at the same time as written human history, at the same time as the pharaohs. The Ice Age is not as far away as you think. Its last giants were grazing an Arctic island, while human civilization was already well underway. And what finally finished the rangal mammoths? For a long time, the obvious guess was inbreeding, that this tiny isolated population must have slowly rotted from the inside, accumulating genetic defects until it collapsed in a kind of slow-motion genetic meltdown. But a remarkable study, reading the genomes of the rangal mammoths across the generations, found something surprising and, to me, deeply poignant. The population was inbred, yes, and had low diversity, but it appears to have been genetically stable, hanging on, not spiraling toward doom. Which suggests that what killed them at the end was not a slow genetic decline at all, but something sudden, a random catastrophe, perhaps a single harsh event, a disease, a bad run of weather, a freak event that a tiny isolated population simply could not absorb. The last mammoths may not have faded away. They may have been snuffed out abruptly by bad luck after surviving everything else for thousands of lonely years. There is a researcher who studies these ancient genomes who put it in a way I cannot forget, that the rangal mammoths were doing fine, more or less, right up until they very suddenly were not. The second image is even smaller and even sadder. On St. Paul Island, another remote speck, a different group of mammoths held on, and the evidence suggests that what killed them in the end was the simplest thing imaginable. They ran out of fresh water. As the climate shifted, the island's lakes shrank, and the mammoths, it seems, died of thirst. The last of a lineage millions of years old, dying on a shrinking island for want of something to drink. That is how the giants went. Not in a single dramatic blow, not by a comet, but slowly and unevenly and from many directions at once, the world changing under them, a new predator among them, and at the very last, on the final islands, simple bad luck and a drying lake. And when it was over, the earth had lost its great ice age fauna forever, and entered the strangely empty world, empty of giants, that we were born into and mistake for normal. But as the giants died, something else was being born. Because in that newly warm, newly stable world at the end of the Ice Age, a few groups of humans were about to do something that no creature had ever done before, something that would remake the entire planet, and lead in a straight line to the device you are listening to me on right now. Chapter 23. The world warms and everything changes. Around 11,700 years ago, as I told you, the climate snapped warm and this time stayed warm. Geologists give this new chapter of Earth's history its own name. They call it the Holocene, the wholly recent age, and it is, quite simply, the world you live in. Every empire, every city, every harvest, every word ever written, the entire span of what we call history, has happened inside this one warm, unusually stable stretch of climate that opened when the last ice age finally let go. We are Holocene people, but we were made by the Ice Age, and I want to show you the hinge between the two because it is the most consequential turning point in the human story, and it happened right here in the thaw. For more than 200,000 years, every single human being who had ever lived had fed themselves the same fundamental way, by foraging, by hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. It is how our species spent the overwhelming majority of its existence. And then, in a few special places, within a few thousand years of the Ice Age ending, some people stopped chasing their food and started growing it. They began to plant seeds and tend them and harvest them. They began to pen and breed animals instead of hunting them. They invented farming, and nothing about us has been the same since. I want to slow down here because this is so familiar that we forget how strange and enormous it is. Why did people who had successfully foraged for 2,000 centuries suddenly, in several different parts of the world at roughly the same time, take up farming? And here is what I find so thrilling. The answer points straight back at everything we have been talking about, the climate and the thaw, and even possibly the younger Dryas itself. Think about it from the forager's side. During the wild instability at the end of the Ice Age, the warming, the cold snaps, the younger Dryas plunging the world back into drought and cold for 1,000 years, the reliable old way of life would have been under terrible strain. There is a powerful idea, argued over but genuinely compelling, that the younger Dryas drought in the Near East may have been one of the pressures that pushed certain people toward cultivation. In a region like the Fertile Crescent, the great arc of land running through the modern Near East, there happened to grow wild stands of the ancestors of wheat and barley, grasses with fat, nutritious seeds. As the climate lurched and the wild harvests grew unreliable, people who had been gathering those wild grains may have begun, at first, simply to protect them, to tend them, to scatter a few seeds to make sure there would be more next year. And once the warm, stable Holocene arrived, that tending could blossom into full farming. The Ice Age created the pressure. The warm world that followed created the opportunity. There is a people I want you to meet at this exact hinge, because they sit right on the line between the two worlds. We call them the Natufians, and they lived in the Near East right around the end of the Ice Age and into the early thaw. And the Natufians are fascinating because they did something almost no foragers had done before. They settled down before they were farmers. They built houses, real houses of stone, and lived in them year-round in villages, while still mostly hunting and gathering, living off the rich wild harvests of grain in their landscape. They buried their dead among their homes. They ground wild grain on stone. They are the bridge made flesh. Foragers who had stopped wandering, sitting on the very threshold of the agricultural world, and when the climate pushed, it was people like them who stepped across. And once that step was taken, everything we think of as civilization came tumbling out of it fast. Farming meant you could grow a surplus, more food than you needed today. Surplus meant some people no longer had to produce food at all and could become something else. A potter, a priest, a soldier, a king, a scribe. Farming tied people to the land, to fields they had to defend and irrigate, and that meant ownership and property and inequality and organization. Settled surplus-producing villages grew into towns, and towns into the first cities. And in those cities, only a few thousand years after the last mammoths still walked Rangel Island, human beings invented writing and arithmetic and law and the state. Everything I have told you about elsewhere, the Sumerians and their clay tablets, the pharaohs and their pyramids, all of it grew from that single shift at the end of the Ice Age, when a handful of people in a warming world bent down and planted a seed on purpose. I do not want to give you the impression it was all triumph. It is one of the great ironies of our story that farming, which built everything, also cost us a great deal. The skeletons tell it plainly. The earliest farmers were often shorter, sicker, and more worn down than the foragers who came before them. Their diets were narrower. Living packed together with their animals gave us our great plagues. The long, hard, monotonous labor of the fields was, in many ways, a worse daily life than the varied work of the forager. We did not take up farming because it made individual lives better. We took it up because it let far more people exist on the same land, and a way of life that makes more of you will always, in the end, win out over one that makes fewer, whatever it costs each person. We traded the freedom and health of the forager for the numbers and power of the farmer. And there is a real sense in which we have been living with that bargain uneasily ever since. And that bargain, the mismatch between the world our bodies were built for and the world we actually made, turns out not to be ancient history at all. It is sitting inside you right now, in your cravings and your sleep and your anxieties. Because here is the truth I have been building toward this whole time, the one I most want you to carry away. You are not a modern animal that happens to know about the Ice Age. You are an Ice Age animal, living in a world that vanished beneath your feet. Let me show you what I mean. Chapter 24. You are an Ice Age animal. I want to make this personal now, because everything in this episode has been leading here, to you, to the body you are sitting in, listening to me. Your body, your brain, your instincts, your appetites, they were not designed for the world you live in. They were forged in the Ice Age. Evolution is slow, and the world we built for ourselves came fast. Agriculture only 12,000 years ago, cities only a few thousand, and the modern world of supermarkets and screens and central heating only a heartbeat ago. Your biology has not had time to catch up. In almost every way that matters, you are still a Pleistocene forager, a creature of the Mammoth steppe and the painted cave, wearing modern clothes and wondering why you feel the way you do. Scientists call the result evolutionary mismatch, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. Start with food because it is the clearest. Why do you crave sugar and fat and salt so powerfully, even when you know better, even when it harms you? Because for an Ice Age forager, those things were rare, precious, and life-saving. Sugar meant ripe fruit or honey, a burst of energy you might not find again for weeks. Fat was the richest fuel there was, the difference between surviving the winter and not. Salt was scarce and essential. An animal that gorged on these whenever it found them, that could not resist them, lived. The one who could take or leave a honeycomb left fewer children. So evolution built that craving deep into us, a craving that was pure wisdom in a world of scarcity. And then we, cleverly, built a world in which sugar and fat and salt are not scarce at all but endless and $1 away, and the ancient wisdom became a trap. The diseases of modern abundance, the obesity, the diabetes, are, in a real sense, Ice Age instincts running loose in a world the Ice Age never imagined. Your sweet tooth is a forager's sweet tooth. It is just that the forager's world is gone. It does not stop at food. Why do so many of us struggle to sleep, lying awake in the dark? Perhaps because for hundreds of thousands of years the dark was genuinely dangerous, and a brain that stayed a little alert, a little watchful at night, a brain that woke and listened, kept its owner alive. Why do we feel a jolt of fear at a spider or a snake far out of proportion to the actual danger they pose in a modern city, while feeling almost no instinctive fear of cars or electrical sockets, which are vastly more likely to harm us? Because spiders and snakes were real killers on the Mammoth steppe, and our fear of them is ancient and burned in, while cars are so new that evolution has not had a single moment to teach us to dread them. Our fears are a museum of Ice Age dangers. And consider the deepest one of all other people. Why does social rejection hurt so much, so physically, so disproportionately? Why do we ache to belong, to be approved of, to not be cast out? Because for an Ice Age human, the group was everything. To be expelled from your band, alone on the Mammoth steppe, was very nearly a death sentence. There were no strangers to take you in, no society to fall back on. Your fellow humans were your only food security, your only defense, your only warmth. So we evolved to need each other desperately, to fear exclusion as we fear death, because for our ancestors it very nearly was death. There is even an idea, associated with the researcher Robin Dunbar, that our brains are built to handle social groups of only around 150 real relationships, roughly the size of the bands and networks we lived in for all those millennia. And now we live in cities of millions and carry devices that show us thousands of faces and judgments a day. And we wonder why we feel so anxious, so lonely, so overwhelmed by a social world our Ice Age brains were never built to hold. We are forager minds drowning in a flood of strangers. Do you see what I am telling you? The Ice Age is not a distant chapter that ended and was filed away. You are carrying it. It is in your cravings and your fears, your need to belong, your restless nights, your love of a warm fire and a told story in the dark. When you feel the pull of these things, you are feeling the mammoth step, still alive inside you, tens of thousands of years on. We never left the Ice Age. We brought it with us. And here is where the story bends back on itself in the strangest possible way. Because we, the Ice Age animals, having driven the giants to extinction at the end of the Ice Age, are now seriously trying to bring them back. There are scientists today working to resurrect the woolly mammoth, or at least to engineer a cold-adapted elephant that could play the mammoth's role. By reading the mammoth genome, we recovered from those frozen bodies in the permafrost and editing it into the cells of its living elephant cousins. There is a project in Siberia, a place its founders call Pleistocene Park, that is deliberately trying to rebuild the mammoth steppe itself, bringing in large grazing animals to trample the moss and restore the ancient grassland, in the genuine hope that herds of mammoths might one day walk it again. Whether they truly succeed, and whether they should, is a real and serious debate, but sit with the sheer strangeness of it. The creature that helped kill the mammoths is now trying to undo that death, to reach back across 10,000 years and pull the giants back into the world. The Ice Age animal, dreaming of resurrecting the Ice Age. Why would we want to? Partly wonder, partly guilt, and partly, I think, something more urgent. Because some of these scientists believe that restoring those great cold grasslands and their herds might help hold the carbon in the frozen ground, might be a small weapon against the thing that now threatens us. And that brings me, at the last, to the reason this whole story is not just a beautiful tale about a vanished world. Because the Ice Age has one final thing to tell us, and it is the most important thing of all, and it is about our own future. Chapter 25, The Mirror. I have one more place to take you, and it is the present. Because everything I have spent these hours telling you, the ice and the giants, the drowned lands, the painted caves, the stalled ocean, and the thousand-year winter, all of it turns out to be a mirror. And when we look into it honestly, we see ourselves, right now in this century, more clearly and more uncomfortably than we might like. Here is why. To understand the Ice Age, scientists had to learn in extraordinary detail how the Earth's climate actually works, what makes it warm and cool, what makes it stable, and what makes it lurch, where its switches and tipping points lie. And the great lesson written in the ice cores and the ocean sediments and the ancient pollen is the one I have come back to again and again. The climate is not a gentle dial. It is a system with thresholds, capable of sudden, violent, self-locking change. The younger Dryas proved it. A flood of fresh water stalled the ocean's conveyor and flipped a warming world back into a thousand-year winter within a human lifetime. The climate has done this before. It can do it again. It is not a steady backdrop to our lives. It is a beast that can turn. Now hold that knowledge up against what we are doing. As the last ice age ended, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere rose, that natural rise that helped melt the ice and warm the world. It was a large change, and it transformed the planet. But it took thousands of years. It was slow enough that life and the climate could lurch and stagger but ultimately adjust. We are now driving carbon dioxide up again by burning the buried remains of ancient life. But we are doing it not over thousands of years, but over a couple of centuries. The best estimates are that we are changing the composition of the atmosphere something like tens of times faster than it changed at the end of the Ice Age. We have taken a transformation that nature performed slowly enough for the world to cope, and we are running it at a speed the planet has rarely, if ever, seen. We are not nudging the beast gently, we are jolting it. And we know from the Ice Age what this system does when it is jolted hard enough. It does not just warm smoothly and politely. It risks crossing thresholds. The very ocean conveyor that failed during the younger Dryas, the Atlantic circulation that keeps Europe mild, is being watched anxiously by scientists right now, because the melting of Greenland's ice is pouring fresh water into the North Atlantic, the same kind of fresh water that stalled the engine 12,900 years ago. There are real, sober scientists warning that this circulation is slowing, and that we do not know exactly where its tipping point lies. There is the permafrost, that frozen Ice Age ground I told you about, the ground that preserved the mammoth so perfectly, which holds an immense store of carbon, and which, as it thaws, can release that carbon and warm the world further, which thaws more permafrost. Another of those runaway feedbacks, another switch we are leaning on without knowing how much pressure it will take to flip. The Ice Age taught us that these switches are real. We are now testing them, with our whole civilization riding on the outcome. And there is the matter of the giants. I told you that the end of the Ice Age saw one of the greatest extinctions in the history of life, the great beasts vanishing across the world, with the climate and our own hunting both pressing down on them. Many scientists believe we are now living through another great extinction, a sixth one, and that this time the hand on the trigger is unmistakably and entirely ours. The pattern that began on the Mammoth steppe, large, slow-breeding, magnificent animals disappearing in our wake, never really stopped. It is still running. The elephants and the rhinos, the very survivors I told you about, the last great megafauna that made it through the Ice Age, are now the ones we are pushing toward the edge. There is a term some geologists now use for our age, the Anthropocene, the age of humans, the moment when one species became a force as powerful as the ice sheets and the orbits and the volcanoes, powerful enough to reshape the climate and the living world of the entire planet. The Ice Age was shaped by forces vaster than any creature. We have become one of those forces, and we are not at all sure we know how to wield it. I do not tell you this to frighten you or to end on despair. I tell you because the Ice Age is the only long, detailed record we have of how this planet behaves when its climate changes, and it is, therefore, the single most valuable thing we own for facing what is coming. The people who pieced together the story of the younger Dryas were not just solving an old puzzle. They were reading the manual for our own future. The ice cores that hold the ancient air are the same cores that warn us what our air is becoming. The drowned coastlines of Doggerland are a preview of coastlines that will drown again, with cities on them this time. The Ice Age is not behind us. In every way that matters, it is the rehearsal for the test we are now sitting. And here, at the very end, let me bring you back to where we began. Back to the shore of that vanished lake at White Sands, to the footprints, the trackway of a young person, carrying a child, hurrying across the mud more than 20,000 years ago, with the giant ground sloth and the mammoth moving nearby. I have carried that image through this whole journey, and now I want to give it back to you with everything we have learned pressed into it. That person did not know they were living in an ice age. They did not know the ice would melt, or that the giants would die, or that the lake at their feet would vanish and leave their footprints to harden into stone and wait 20,000 years for us to find them. They were just a person, alive on an ordinary day, carrying a child they loved across the cold mud, hurrying home. And that is what we all are. Every one of us across this whole immense story, the Neanderthal old man cared for at Shanada, the artist crawling into Chauvet with a torch, the hands pressed to the cave wall, the child buried at Sungir under 10,000 ivory beads, the Natufian planting the first deliberate seed. You, listening to me now, we are all just people, alive on an ordinary day, in a world we did not choose and do not fully understand, carrying what we love across the mud, hurrying home. The Ice Age people did not know their world was ending and another beginning. Neither, really, do we. We are walking across our own stretch of soft ground, leaving our own footprints in a moment that will one day be deep time to whoever comes after. So here is the spark I want to leave you with. The next time you crave something sweet, the next time the dark makes you uneasy, the next time you ache to belong, the next time you feel the pull of a fire and a told story on a cold night, remember what you are. You are an Ice Age animal. You are the descendant of survivors who walked out of Africa into a frozen world, who lived among giants, who crossed drowning land bridges and open seas, who painted in the dark and buried their dead with treasure and refused to accept that death was the end, who endured the thousand-year winter and walked out the other side into the warm world that gave us everything. Their blood is in you. Their fears and their loves are in you. Their footprints are under your feet. And the same restless, wondering, storytelling mind that drove them deep into those caves to leave the mark that says I was here, that is the mind you are using right now to look back across all that distance and recognize them. Across 20,000 years, you reached out and you touched a hand pressed to the rock, and it was the same size as yours. Go and look at the world that the ice built. It is the only one we have. And it is, still, after everything, a wonder